Yo, what's up guys, Alf here. Today I'm going to be doing a video breaking down 25 Theorycraft decklists from Modern Horizons 3 for Timeless and Historic, built around the new cards from the set. So if you're not aware, what I've mainly been focusing on for the past few weeks is this kind of in-depth set review article series that I've been doing on the MTGA's own site. So this is basically a 3-part set review, going in-depth on the majority of the high-impact cards from Modern Horizons 3, as you can see here, you know, talking about the potential homes and applications, talking about how strong I think they are and you know, where they could fit into the metagame potentially. And as part of that, I've also been putting together a bunch of Theorycraft decklists, as you can see here. So since this series has gone out, what I've basically done is I've compiled all of the Theorycraft decklists from this article series into a single article. So basically we've got a resource here that has all of the decklists together if you want ideas of stuff to try on day one when the set drops. So I'll have a link to the set review articles down in the description if you haven't checked them out, and I'll also have a link down to this article which has all the decklists in it. So basically what I'm going to do in this video is go through all of the Theorycraft decklists, talk you through all the card choices, how I came up with them, what I think the deck could do in the format, you know, what impact I think it could have, and also potential ways that you could alter the list depending on what the metagame is, because obviously, you know, it's going to be pretty hard to predict what the metagame is because there's so many new cards coming into both formats. Now I will say before I get into it that the majority of the decks here will be timeless, because I just think that's the more interesting format to look at, especially with the, you know, the pitch elementals and the flare cycle and stuff like that. But if you're a historic player and you're not interested in timeless, I'll obviously have all of the deck lists as timestamps in the description, so you can skip ahead if you want. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. So we're starting off with Timeless, and out of Timeless we're going to start off with Raptor Scam. So Raptor Scam, one of the best decks in Modern for quite a while, and if you're not familiar with what this deck does, it's basically a mid-range deck with a lot of early interaction, particularly hand hate in the form of 4 Thoughtseize and then 4 Grief. And the reason this deck is called Scam is because it has these Scam starts where you can evoke Grief on turn 1, and then cast a card like Not Dead After All on it. So Grief enters the battlefield, you get to remove a card from the opponent's hand, cast Not Dead After All on it, Grief comes back from the graveyard, then you get a second trigger, so you get 2 cards out of the opponent's hand, and you get to keep the Grief on the battlefield, which is a turn 1 3/2 or a turn 1 4/3 menace after a Not Dead After All, which is a very powerful start, particularly against high synergy decks. So the main changes that I've made from this list, moving from Modern to Timeless, is in Timeless we obviously get Reanimate, which is a really big addition to this deck, because Reanimate also enables these turn 1 Grief Scam starts where you evoke the Grief and then just reanimate it. Now obviously in this particular instance that is worse than Not Dead After All, because you lose the life and you also don't get the +1/+1 counter from Not Dead After All. But I think Reanimate is just going to be much better, because outside of that I think Reanimate is just a much better card, particularly in top deck wars. Not Dead After All can be useful in longer games to protect your creatures from interaction. I think particularly the situation of having a Bowmasters in play, if the opponent uses a Bowmasters against yours and you Not Dead After All, your Bowmasters immediately comes back, which then pings down the opponent's Bowmasters, and it comes back as a 2/2, meaning that future Bowmasters can't kill it either. So that interaction seems really nice, but in general Reanimate is just going to be much more useful, because you can just reanimate any creature from your graveyard without needing the opponent to interact with it, like Not Dead After All, for example. So that's a really big addition. Because of running Reanimate, I also think you absolutely want to be running Troll of Khazad-dûm as just another very powerful early play, and I think Troll is a really nice addition to this sort of deck as well, because the big weakness of a deck like Raptor Scam is that the opponent can top deck out of it, right? The real strength of this deck is the early Thoughtseize, the early Grief Scams, to get rid of the opponent's hand and slow them down. From that point, you really then need to start closing the game out really quickly to minimize the amount of top decks the opponent has to get back into the game. And going, you know, turn 1 Grief Scam into turn 2 cycle Troll Reanimate is basically just going to close the game out really, really quickly, right? Give the opponent 2 or 3 turns to draw out of it, and they also need to kill your big creatures to stabilize as well. So I think Troll is going to be really big at closing games out. Now, in this particular list, I'm running the bare minimum number of Scam cards that you can get away with. I think 5 is the bare minimum, right? We've got 4 Reanimate, 1 Not Dead After All. If I was going to make a change to this, I imagine you probably want to go up 1 or 2 Not Dead After Alls. I don't think I like running 8, because the issue with running Not Dead After All in higher numbers is it does lower your overall card quality. Like I said, this can be useful in longer games if your creatures are getting killed by a destruction-based removal, but it isn't a very powerful card. If you have no creatures in play, you know, especially in Grief mirror matches when it comes down to top decking, this can be a bit of a liability. But having said that, you do want to maximize your chances of getting the turn 1 Grief, so I could imagine myself, you know, maybe cutting a Molten Collapse for a second Not Dead After All, or, you know, another card for a third, for example. I'm a little bit sketchy to cut the Molten Collapse, because then the deck doesn't really have any good way of dealing with a bigger creature like a Tractor if the opponent natural orders, for example. But I think the correct number for Scam cards will probably be somewhere between 5 and 7. One other change I've made to this list is I've cut the Dothy Voidwalker for a Deathrite Shaman, because obviously Voidwalker isn't legal. And I do think that provides some extra benefits here, right? It enables you to cast Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Blood Moon after sideboard on turn 2, which is a really big deal, especially against the Titan deck, for example. So that's a pretty nice swap. Obviously, Dotty Voidwalker is probably the more powerful proactive card, but Deathrite Shaman does give you good reach as well, right? Once this has provided you with the ramp, it also gives you Graveyard Hate off the Overgrown Tomb, which could be relevant, and it also enables you to deal 2 every turn by exiling instants and sorceries from the graveyard, so it gives you a bit of extra reach as well, which is pretty big. In terms of the effect that this sort of deck is likely to have on the format, obviously the amount of hand hate that this deck has, especially with the Grief Scam starts, that's going to be a big hit to high synergy decks, particularly combo decks. If you want to be able to beat Raptor Scam, I think the best way to do that is probably with just decks that are running generically powerful cards, so other mid-range decks, bigger mid-range decks that are running cards like the One Ring and Omnath and Up the Beanstalk. Obviously all of those cards are weak to Baymasters, but those are all cards that can just snowball the game, undo the early hand hate that this deck sort of provides. But either way, I expect this to be a really good deck to pick up day one, because we can just look at what was working in Modern, port it over, and I'm sure it will do really well. Plus we get significant upgrades, like I said, with Reanimate, Troll of Khazad-dûm, and Deathrite Shaman is also a nice upgrade as well. One other thing as well, because this is going to come up a few times, because obviously a lot of these timeless lists are going to have the pitch elementals in, is when you're deck building with the elementals, you do need to ensure that you have enough cards of each colour to be able to pitch to them. Having looked at Frank Carson articles and modern deck lists, the minimum I'm going to be trying to achieve to consistently enable these is 16. So if you are building with the pitch elementals, I think you should always aim for 16 coloured cards. If you're struggling, I think a really effective way to try and boost up the number of coloured cards for your pitch elementals is to run the new MDFCs. So in this set, we're getting 8 MDFCs for each colour, 1 non-creature and 1 creature. So if you do want to up the coloured count and you're not running a super intensive mana base, you could maybe just cut some lands for MDFCs to boost the colours. But yeah, just a deck building note, try and aim for 16 coloured card for each of the pitch elementals. And then next up we got another deck that we can kind of port over from Modern, which is Up the Beanstalk. So if you're not familiar with this deck, it's basically a deck kind of built around Up the Beanstalk, 2 mana enchantment that draws when it ETBs, and then whenever you cast a card that costs 5 or more, you also draw a card. So in this particular list, that draws us cards off Leyline Binding, Solitude and Fury. So these are all obviously cards that are powerful enough to run on their own, so that's the reason that the Beanstalk is so powerful. It's a card that basically makes all of your other good cards even better, right? And that's particularly good with Solitude and Fury, because if you have to evoke these, that's usually card disadvantage. But if you have the Beanstalk in play and you evoke these, then that's card neutral. If you have the Beanstalk in play and you hardcast these, that's card advantage. And if you can get these in multiples, you can evoke these and just turn it into card advantage anyway, which is super, super powerful. So as I mentioned, I think this sort of list is going to be a really good way to counteract the scam decks, because you have so many good top decks that can get you out of the situation, right? You've got Minsk and Boo, Omnath, Up the Beanstalk, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, your pitch elementals, Oko. These are all cards that can get you back into the game after a very early grief scam. And these are also cards that are going to make creature decks, you know, this deck is going to be super, super good against creature decks, because you've got 4 Solitude, 4 Fury, 4 Leyline Binding, 4 Swords to Plowshares. In terms of these cards as well, obviously we do need to have enough colours to pitch to Solitude and Fury. In terms of the white cards, we've got some really good interaction. We've got Swords to Plowshares and Leyline Binding. There is a conversation to be had about Swords to Plowshares versus another card we're getting in Prismatic Ending. I just think Swords to Plowshares is the better main deck card, because I think the majority of the time, game 1, you're going to be using this against creatures, and Swords to Plowshares is just much, much better against creatures, because it's always 1 mana and it's instant speed as well, and it can take out bigger creatures like Atraxa as well, which is a very big deal. And then Leyline Binding, obviously just incredibly good in this sort of deck that can enable it, especially with Up the Beanstalk. Then the red cards for Fury, we've got Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is obviously just an incredibly good generic threat. Omnath is another really, really good threat that also pitches to Solitude as well. You know, very generically powerful threat, produces a bunch of mana to help you get ahead early on as well, which is huge. And then Minsk and Boo is just another powerful threat as well. Now, before I go any further, I do want to give a shout out to Respect the Cat. They're a very good modern player who also has a YouTube channel, so I'll have a link to their YouTube channel down in the description. They were working on these kind of bigger versions of Up the Beanstalk. So in Modern, if you're not familiar with those decks, there were 2 main variations of Up the Beanstalk. One was a Cascade variant, which we can't run in Timeless because we don't have the 3 mana Cascade cards. And then the other variants was basically like this, where you're running a bunch of generically powerful mid-range threats. And Respect the Cat was having really good success with these sorts of builds. So I had a look at their builds, and they were basically the inspiration for this. You know, I was looking at the the ratio of interaction to threats and the mana curve and stuff like that. So shout out to them because they were kind of the inspiration behind this list. One change I've made from their list to this timeless version is they were running the One Ring at the 4-mana slot. I decided to replace that with Minsc and Boo for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I think Minsc and Boo is going to be a lot better against both combo and Titanfield as well. I think those are probably two of the more difficult matchups for this deck because we don't have discard spells, we don't have counter spells in the main deck either. So I think, you know, the difference between this and an aggro deck is you're obviously going to take a while to close the game out. So Minsc and Boo just being able to apply a lot more pressure a lot more quickly should improve your matchup against the more difficult matchups like Titan and Combo, for example. And then additionally, running Minsc and Boo over the One Ring also means that this is a red card for Fury, which then means the final slot in the deck we can run a card that isn't red or white while still having enough cards of each colour to pitch to Solitude and Fury. So in the final slot in the deck, I'm running Oko Thief of Crowns, which I just think is probably the most generically powerful mid-range threat in the whole format. So seems like a great card to be running here as a 4 of. The only other card that I would consider running in this slot is potentially Dig Through Time or Treasure Cruise as another card to trigger up the Beanstalk, but you know, I think just having Oko as a generically powerful threat is going to be, you know, have a much more immediate impact in the game. And I think this deck is already good enough at drawing cards, already good enough at grinding into longer games, that I think you probably just want a higher density of threats that can have an immediate impact on the game rather than more ways to draw cards off up the Beanstalk, right? I think this deck is going to be fine for card advantage, if that makes sense. So overall, I expect this to be another deck that is going to be fairly successful straight away because we know from Modern these decks are super powerful, and especially if Grief is very popular, having this higher density of generically powerful cards should enable you to top deck out of those early Grief scams a lot more easily. One other thing that I want to touch on before we move on is Yorion. So obviously Yorion is banned in Modern and is a really good tool, especially if Grief is very popular. And quickly, while I'm on that tangent, I do think even though Grief is going to be very popular and very powerful, that I don't think it's going to have as big of an impact in Timeless as it does in Modern, because we have a lot more tools to be able to counteract the early Grief scam, like the companions like Lurrus and Yorion. I believe scam didn't really start taking off in Modern until Lurrus was banned, probably because the extra resources are a really good way to recover from Grief scam. And additionally, we've got Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise, both of which Grief fuels as well, helps you get more cards in the graveyard. And then we've obviously got stuff like Up the Beanstalk, which we've got here as well. So we do have a lot more tools to be able to fight Grief if you're concerned that Grief scam is just going to be a nightmare to be able to deal with. On Yorion though, I personally... Well, initially, I'm definitely going to start off with 60 card variants because I think running an 80 card variant when your deck is built somewhat around Up the Beanstalk, not only are you less likely to find Beanstalk itself, which is kind of the key card that allows you to go over the top of a lot of other decks, but you also, you would have to run more cards that cost 5 or more to consistently get value off Up the Beanstalk. As I mentioned, you could run Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, but I think they're generally lower quality than Solitude, Fury, and Leyline Binding. So not only are you more likely to find Up the Beanstalk in a 60 card variant, but you're also much more likely to find your Solitude, Fury, and Leyline Binding without having to run other cards like Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise. You can obviously run Lawyer and Revealed as well, but having to pay 5 mana for your spells to get value off Up the Beanstalk isn't really what this deck is about, I don't think. So I think Yorion builds will be viable for sure, especially if Grief is everywhere and you do want that extra resource. But I feel like when your deck is built around Up the Beanstalk, a 60 card variant finds the Beanstalk more consistently and then also finds the better payoffs for it as well, if that makes sense. So that's my logic anyway. Then next up, we got an upgrade to one of the decks that I've worked the most on since Timeless came out, and that is Titanfield. And the big upgrade that we're getting here is Flare of Cultivation. So super powerful card, basically can work as a Cultivate for free. And in this particular list, I think the cards that work the best with Flare of Cultivation are going to be Arboreal Grazer and Cameo Bamboo Groves. And Titanfield is obviously just running these as 4-ofs anyway, so it seems like an excellent fit here. And this is going to enable some incredibly busted starts where you can get Primeval Titan down on turn 2 in multiple different ways. I think the most consistent way of doing that will be going Arboreal Grazer or Cameo Bamboo Groves on turn 1, putting a Sunken Citadel into play. Then you can sack one of these two Flare of Cultivation to put a basic in play. And then if you've got a Castle Garenbrig in your hand, you can play the Garenbrig, and then you've got 6 mana on turn 2, just cast a Primeval Titan straight away. You can also do the same thing with Natural Order if you have a Colony Garden to put into play off one of your Arboreal Grazers or Cameo Bamboo Groves. So this is going to enable some incredibly fast starts. Now, you do need to make some deck building changes in order to enable this. I don't think 4 Grazer, 4 Cami is enough, even with 4 Once Upon a Time, to find them more consistently. So one other change that I'm going to be making going forwards is going back to Fierce Empath instead of Archdruid's Charm. Now we have 12 creatures that can enable the Flare of Cultivation that we can also find of Once Upon a Time, which seems pretty decent to me. That seems like a good number. Now, my one concern with this is that when Flare of Cultivation, once Flare of Cultivation becomes a known thing in Titan, I think the opponent is going to be very incentivized to kill your creatures in response to the ETB. So say, for example, you're on the draw and you go Arboreal Grazer on turn 1. I think the opponent is going to prioritize killing your Grazer with the trigger on the stack so that you can't use Flare of Cultivation, because it also then cuts you off natural order as well. So I do have some concerns that the opponent prioritizing killing your non-token green creatures is going to result in you not having a creature to sack to Flare of Cultivation. But if the opponent uses their removal on your Grazer or Kami or Fierce Empath that you've already gotten value off, that's a pretty decent exchange for you. And this honestly isn't the worst card ever to hard cast. Obviously, you're not thrilled to be casting just Cultivate on turn 2 or 3 in Timeless, but again, the opponent is having to use their removal spells on your Grazer or Kami, which isn't a great exchange for them as well. So I think just hard casting this isn't too bad either. Now, one other reason why why I think it's necessary to swap from Archdruid's Charm to Fierce Empath is because another deck building change we need to make for Flare of Cultivation is obviously we need to be running more basics. So I think the bare minimum number of basics you can get away with Flare of Cultivation is probably 4, which is what I'm starting off here, right? We've got Forest, Plains, Snow-Covered Forest, Snow-Covered Plains. Obviously, Wight is the splash colour here for Get Lost and High Noon in the sideboard. So I think that's the bare minimum. The risk with only running 4 basics is that the second or third copies that you draw Flare of Cultivation are going to become dead pretty quickly. But the other issue with running basics is that you don't want to be running too many lands with the same name. We're already having to run, 4 Sunken Citadel, 3 Field of the Dead, 4 Castle Garenbrig. So having to run, multiple Snow-Covered Forests makes it more likely that Field of the Dead is going to be delayed, which can make a really big difference to you being able to stabilize in certain matchups. So that's definitely a consideration. And because of that, I think it's going to be really difficult to have triple green on turn 2 or 3 for Archdruid's Charm when we're having to run stuff like Plains and Snow-Covered Plains, for example. So I think that's another reason why I think it's important to cut Archdruid's Charm and go back to Fierce Empath. We'll have to see if 4 basics is enough. Obviously, if it's not, then you could consider running a second Snow-Covered Forest. You could even consider running an off-color basic, but I'm not sure I'm too thrilled about that. My other main concern with this list, I do think this is very likely to work, but my other main concern is, like I said, the opponent is going to be incentivized to kill your creatures with the ETB trigger on the stack, which makes me worried that we don't have enough targets for Natural Order. Because if you look at this list, the card I've cut to make room for Flare of Cultivation is Sylvan Scrying. And the big difference between the old list and this is that Sylvan Scrying could work as a way to enable Natural Order, because you can Sylvan Scrying for Colony Garden, get a green token, and then sacrifice that for Natural Order. Replacing Sylvan Scrying with Flare of Cultivation now means that we have 4 fewer less cards for Natural Order. 4 fewer cards that enable Natural Order. So that's another concern I've got. I'm not sure there's a great solution to that other than running more Colony Gardens in the mana base, and without having to run more lands with the same name, which delays Field of the Dead. The only solution to that I could think of is maybe cutting Sunken Citadels for Colony Garden, but that kind of defeats the whole point, because I think with Titanfield specifically, you want to be doing your proactive game plan as fast as possible, which is why I think Flare of Cultivation is going to be a really nice boost to this deck, because it will just speed up the deck a lot, which is a really big deal. But having to cut Sunken Citadel for Colony Garden is a little bit awkward. Because of that, I've been thinking perhaps that you could replace Natural Order with Archdruid's Charm, just cut Natural Order entirely and run Archdruid's Charm. But again, like I've said, it's really difficult to enable Archdruid's Charm in the mana base because you need triple green. And like I said, you want to go as fast as possible. Natural Order is faster at getting Primeval Titan into play than using an Archdruid's Charm to search for it, for example. So we'll have to see. This definitely seems like a deck that you need to test to figure out the ratios. But I do think Flare of Cultivation is going to be a big boon to it. One other card that I want to highlight in the sideboard here is Affectionate Indrik, which might look like a joke. Why would this is like a starter deck card? Why have you got this here? But it's basically here as a tutor target off Fierce Empath that you can use to kill the new blue Blood Moon. So if you haven't seen, Harbinger of the Seas is basically a creature version of Blood Moon. It's basically a Magus of the Moon in blue. And so I think, like we have, we can use Fierce Empath to search Stormcell Vanguard to kill Blood Moon, we need to have a tutorable way to answer the Harbinger of the Seas as well. And Affectionate Indrik seems like the best option because it's basically just a creature that can fight it that you can cast for a single green. So you only need to have one basic in play, and it's super easy to find your first basic in this list. So this is basically here as an answer to Harbinger of the Seas. I think there's a chance Harbinger of the Seas might not see that much play, but I think it's worth running in the sideboard just as a one-off tutor target, because just having this in the 75 gives you so much insulation against that card, for example. But either way, I'm super excited to return to Titanfield and figure out the ratios and see how much of a big upgrade Flow of Cultivation is going to be. Then next up, we got another list that I'm really excited to play and I think could be very powerful, and that is Woodland Show and Tell. So going through spoiler season for the most of it, I expected Show and Tell to basically not really be a thing anymore. Obviously, with the release of Mana Drain and a lot more blue tempo decks coming into the format, Show and Tell is in a much worse position now than it was a few weeks ago, and it was running riot and dominating the format really. And then with the addition of Grief to the format, I kind of expected that to be the final nail in Show and Tell's coffin. That was until I saw the card Shifting Woodland. This is one of the craziest lands I've ever seen. So the really big thing on this card is if you have Delirium, you can pay for and turn Shifting Woodland into a copy of any permanent in your graveyard. So if you can get Omniscience into the graveyard, you can turn Shifting Woodland into Omniscience, which is so powerful. And I think this is going to be the most important addition to Show and Tell. First of all, just because it gives you insurance against the cards that are good against you. Like I said, Mana Drain has been a really big problem for Show and Tell decks because counter spells and discard spells are just the best answers to Show and Tell. And so Mana Drain, if blue decks are popular going forwards, is going to be ever present. And I think Grief is going to be super popular as well. And Shifting Woodland is the perfect solution to both of those because it's a way you can get Omniscience into play through both discard spells and counter spells. And both of discard spells and counter spells are good at getting stuff into your graveyard to enable Delirium and potentially getting Omniscience into your graveyard as well. So this is going to be really big as kind of a defense mechanism against the main ways to interact with Show and Tell. But more importantly than that, it's another way that you can proactively combo off as well. I think one of the biggest weaknesses of Show and Tell is that the deck is so reliant on a single card Show and Tell, which is only a 4 of, which means, first of all, it can take longer to combo off, and you do sometimes have to run clunky, slow-ish cards like Assemble the Team in order to find it in the first place. So because it's only a 4 of, it can take a while to find it to be able to combo off, and it also makes you very, very vulnerable to extraction effects, both in terms of discard spell into surgical extraction, and also cards like Necromancer as well. And so Shifting Woodland being another proactive way that you can go off should really, really improve that, because not only does it mean if the opponent extracts the Show and Tell, you still have a way to combo off with Omniscience, but it also means that you now have 8 proactive cards that can go off, which should really speed up your ability to assemble the combo and go off as well, which is a really, really big deal. So there are definitely some deck building challenges when trying to enable this card in a Show and Tell shell. So first of all, you need to be able to get Show and Tell get Omniscience into the graveyard. You can't rely on the opponent doing it right. If Shifting Woodland does become stock in Show and Tell and the opponent is running a Grief Thoughtseize deck, they're just going to pick every other card in your hand that isn't Omniscience and just leave you stranded with Omniscience. And then, like I said as well, it's super important to be able to use Shifting Woodland proactively, so you have 8 ways to combo off to increase the consistency and the speed of the deck. So you need to have ways to pitch it into the graveyard. Secondly, we also need to have Delirium. Now, initially I thought that would be really difficult, but thinking about it, you're only ever really going to be using Shifting Woodland once Omniscience is in the graveyard, or sometimes Atraxa, but basically Enchantment is always going to be one of the cards in the graveyard for this to be worth activating. So you only really need 3 other card types, and I think it's going to be very easy, or relatively easy, to get a land in the graveyard off a fetch land, a sorcery in the graveyard off Lorien Revealed or Thoughtseize or Demonic Tutor or Show and Tell, and then the rest of the deck is basically instant. So I actually think it's going to be relatively easy to get 4 card types in the graveyard, especially if you are running looting effects to get Omniscience into the graveyard. They're also another way that you can pitch stuff into the graveyard. So I actually think Delirium is going to be relatively easy to get online without having to run cards like Mishra's Bauble that are really bad when you're trying to combo off. Speaking of which, another card that I don't think you can run because you need Delirium is Dig Through Time. And I think Dig Through Time is such an important card in terms of consistency for Show and Tell, not only at assembling the combo, but also comboing off once you've got Omniscience in play. I think obviously Dig Through Time is relatively easy to enable in a deck full of fetch lands and cheap cantrips to help you combo off. But like I said, we need Delirium for Shifting Woodland, and so I don't think you can run Dig Through Time, which means I think you need to be, now going forwards, be very careful to have enough cantrips in the deck to enable you to win once going off with Show and Tell, because I think if you're familiar, if you're used to playing Show and Tell with Dig Through Time, it's easy to think, oh, you're always going to be able to combo off because Dig Through Time is such an important consistency piece. Now needing Delirium and not needing Dig Through Time, I think you need to ensure that the rest of the deck is able to combo off when you do have Omniscience in play, because otherwise you're going to be copying Omniscience and then just fizzling, which is why I want to avoid running cards like Mishra's Bauble, for example, because they're just a complete dud on turns where you are comboing off. And so, like I said, I think you just need to ensure that you also have enough cards that can help you combo off and going off. So ways of getting Omniscience in the graveyard. I think because you need to have enough ways to combo off, you need these sorts of cards to be proactive looting effects, right? Cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker could be very nice because they're just generically powerful cards that also dig towards the combo and pitch stuff into the graveyard, but Fable doesn't help you combo off once you've got Omniscience in play, right? You cast a Fable, you get a 2/2. That's not good. We need cards that are proactively looting to get Omniscience in the graveyard and also double up as helping us combo off once you've got Omniscience in play. And so the only two colours that really provide that effect are black and red, and I really would much prefer playing black for a number of reasons. So first of all, I really want to be running Thoughtseize in this list. I think Thoughtseize is great because it provides you some interaction, right? This is going to be a deck that has a lot of setup because you're quite an all-in combo deck, but Thoughtseize is great as early interaction to disrupt the opponent. Also is an early sorcery in the graveyard for Delirium, which is going to be a difficult card type to set up if you don't have a Lorien revealed. And also you can also use it as a discard outlet for Omniscience if you're in a pinch. So if you have 5 mana and you've got Shifting Woodland, you can Thoughtseize yourself, get Omniscience in the graveyard, activate Shifting Woodland and combo off. So that's a really big deal. And then also another card that I think is going to be huge is Abrupt Decay in the sideboard, because I do think, especially if this sort of variant of Show and Tell is good, which I'm thinking very well could be, Abrupt Decay is basically a catch-all answer to anything outside of Surgical Extraction, right? It can kill all of the sideboard hate people bring in against you. It can also kill stuff like Vexing Bauble, Boromir, Lavinia through, off Omniscience because it can't be countered as well, which is pretty big. So Abrupt Decay, very, very, very nice sideboard card. So I would prefer to run black rather than red, and I do think we have enough cards in black that enable you to discard it. So first of all, Tainted Indulgence is just the best card in slot for this. Draw 2, discard 1 at instant speed is going to be really nice at setting it up. Past that, the only real next best option we have is Sultai Charm, and obviously, in a vacuum, this is not a timeless playable card. It's very slow at what it's doing, but I think in this particular deck, it's actually pretty good. So first of all, we need a high enough density of discard outlets to enable Omniscience, and being 3 mana is awkward in general, but in this particular list, I don't think it's really that much of a problem because you're not going to be comboing off until turn 4 for the most part, right? We do have Planegenesis that I'll get to in a second, but for the most part, we're going to be going off on turn 4, ideally, if we can. And Sultai Charm being a way that we can set up and then combo off out of nowhere is a really big deal. So you can do stuff like pass with 3 mana open, your opponent does whatever during their turn, and then during their end step, you can activate or play Sultai Charm, draw 2, discard an Omniscience, turn 4, play Shifting Woodland, and then just combo off out of nowhere. And the opponent, that's unexpected. So being instant speed is very big. The combo not being able to go off until 4 mana makes a 3 mana looting effect like this work with the combo. And then outside of that, it also answers hate pieces. I think one of the big weaknesses of Show and Tell in general is most of the lists weren't running interaction in the main deck. This is a way that we can kill creatures, especially creatures like Bowmasters, since we're running a lot of draw effects. And then it also destroys artifacts and enchantments, so this becomes even better post-sideboard as an answer to hate cards like Vexing Bauble and stuff like that. So Sultai Charm might look like a card you would never want to play in Timeless, but in this particular list, where black really struggles to find looting effects, and this deck also needs answers to other hate pieces, I could see this being a good option there as well. Then in terms of other cards, another new card that we're running here is Planegenesis, which is kind of a growth spiral impulse hybrid, right? You can cast this on turn 2 and ramp, and then later in the game, once you have lands, you can use to dig for particular cards. So this is really big because not only does it help us dig towards the Shifting Woodland, but it can also put it into play to accelerate us. And then once you've got that, it can also dig towards other combo pieces. So if we have the Woodland or we have Show and Tell and we need to find Omniscience or Atraxa, this is great at digging towards those. And then once we have Omniscience in play, this is really good at digging towards more cards to help us combo off as well, like our Mastermind's Acquisition, like Lorien Reveal to help us keep going as well. So I think Planegenesis is really going to be a nice upgrade with Shifting Woodland builds as well. And then outside of that, everything's pretty stock. I still think you absolutely want to be running Atraxa here, because the really nice thing about this particular list is it makes specific types of interaction not be good enough, right? If the opponent has discard spells or counter spells, you can just go off with Shifting Woodland. If they have Graveyard Hate, you can just go off with Show and Tell. Even if they have Surgical Extraction for your Omniscience, you can still just go Show and Tell in Atraxa. Even if they have Graveyard Hate, you can just go Show and Tell into Omniscience. So I think the addition of Shifting Woodland could make this deck, still a really big threat, even in the face of Grief and Mana Drain. I'm really excited to try it out. Then next up we got Esper Phelia Blink, this is one of the decks that I'm most excited to try out. So this is a deck that is kind of built around this new card Phelia, which is basically just an upgraded Soul Herder. So Soul Herder, very powerful effect, but it was kind of slow and clunky. This being a mana cheaper, having flash so you can keep, take the opponent by surprise, and being able to exile your opponent's creatures to get them out of the way seems like a really big upgrade. So this is basically a deck that has a bunch of creatures with ETBs for us to enable Phelia. The other really nice thing about running a Blink shell like this is it also enables you to run Ephemerate, which is really, really good. Sorry. With the pitch elementals like Grief and Solitude. So, Grief with Ephemerate on turn 1 is even better than Reanimator, Not Dead After All, because you get 3 triggers, right? You also get the rebound off Ephemerate to get a 3rd card out of the opponent's hands, which is busted. So, Ephemerate decks haven't really been that popular in Modern, but I feel like, particularly in Timeless with the addition of Phelia, we now have more reasons to use that. I also think we have some Timeless exclusive ETB creatures like Juggernaut Peddler that make these sorts of effects even better. So, speaking of which, just have a look at the other cards. So, Juggernaut Peddler, alongside Grief, just has so many ways to pick apart the opponent's hand that this deck seems like it's going to be really good against control and combo, because we can just pick apart the opponent's hand very easily in the early game. Then in terms of interaction, we've got Solitude, which is obviously going to be great with Ephemerate as well, and Phelia in particular, if we can get this in play by hardcasting it or blinking it with an early Ephemerate. Blinking it with the Phelia to just remove the opponent's creatures is going to be a really big play as well. And then we've got a couple copies of Skyclave Apparition for early interaction as well. Then we've also got Satori here, which seems so nice. So this is one of the cards that I was really excited to play with once MH3 came out, because it just felt like a sleeper card. There's so many ways you can abuse this, and this deck has so many ways to trigger Satori. So Satori triggers, first of all, off all of our blink effects. So every time we blink a creature with Phelia or Ephemerate, we get to draw a card. Every time we evoke a pitch elemental like Grief or Solitude, we get to draw a card. Every time we use Reanimate to get a creature back from the graveyard, including Satori itself, we get to draw a card as well. So this seems like a really sick card advantage engine. And then the final creature in the deck, I wanted kind of a generically powerful card that was good to blink and provide card advantage. And I really like Diviner of Fates here because it's just good at smoothing your hand out, digging for particular cards. And then it also has really nice synergy with Troll of Khazad-dûm, which we kind of want to be running alongside Reanimate anyway for the early starts. Reanimate is also another way that we can scam Grief on turn 1 alongside Ephemerate here as well. But then, Troll of Khazad-dûm, if we discard it, we trigger Diviner of Fates during the opponent's turn, for example. We also have Lorien Revealed here as another way that we can trigger Diviner of Fates that then helps us find Reanimate more easily as well. So I think there's just so much nice cross synergy going on. The overall card quality is great. I think this is probably one of the decks that can utilize the pitch elementals the best because we have Ephemerate, we have Reanimate, we have ways to blink them as well. Now, I will say I did build this deck before the full set was spoiled, and I do think that you could potentially upgrade the deck by running Recruiter of the Guard instead of Diviner of Fates, and then you probably would just run lands instead of Lorien Revealed. And then the really nice thing with Recruiter of the Guard is it enables you to find specific cards. So you can tutor for Solitude, you can tutor for Grief, you can tutor for Phelia, you can't tutor for Satori, but that's not really a big deal. And then you could run Skyclave Apparition as a one-off to tutor, and you could also run another card that I'm really excited to try out this list in the sideboard in Stalwart Realm Warden, which seems like this could be just an absolute beating against both control and combo decks that rely on non-creatures, because when it ETBs, the next non-creature spell the opponent casts is going to cost 2 more. If you blink this with an Ephemerate or a Phelia, this just stacks, and if the opponent is relying on non-creatures, you could just completely lock them out of the game. Just keep taxing the next spell by 2 every single turn, and they're just not going to have the mana to cast anything. So if you do run Recruiter of the Guard instead of Diviner of Fates, you can just run Skyclave Apparition as a one-of, and then Realm Warden as a one-of, and then sideboard stuff, we got some more ETB creatures. Honestly, this seems like another list where the sideboard is going to need changing once we know what's going on in the format. Oh, speaking of which, I forgot to say with the Beanstalk deck that, again, I've got some combo hate in the sideboard. It's going to be really difficult to know what the correct cards are going to be. So I think out of all the stuff, the sideboard is probably the part of these decks that will need to be altered the most once we know what is going to be popular in the format, if that makes sense. But either way, I'm so excited to try this one. This is one of my picks that I'm going to try early on, because this deck, just on its face, has so many busted fast starts, but then has a really good grind game as well. Then next up, we got another one that I'm really excited. Honestly, there's so many decks that I'm really excited to try out. This is this set that I'm just the most excited for. But this list is built around this new card, Amped Raptor, which is a card I'm really excited for. So on its face, this is kind of like a 2-mana Bloodbraid Elf if you build your deck around it, especially if you're running a small Lurrus deck. This is fairly easy to enable if you're not running any counter spells, for example. But like I said in the set review, I'm really excited to try this out with turn 1 energy enablers. We have multiple cards that enable you to get 2 energy on turn 1. The guaranteed ways are Attune with Aether and Tune the Narrative. Galvanic Discharge can also work, right? If the opponent plays a Ragavan on turn 1 and you Galvanic Discharge, you kill it and you get 2 energy counters as well. Now, I don't think that's going to happen very often. I don't imagine Ragavan is going to see much play. I mean, obviously the scam decks probably need to play Ragavan to have enough red cards for Fury, but for the most part, I don't think it's going to be super popular, but that'll happen sometimes, right? But the idea here is that we have multiple cards that can get us 2 energy on turn 1, which then opens the possibility of us going Amped Raptor on turn 2 and potentially hitting a 4-drop like Minsk and Boo, or a 3-drop like Oko Thief of Crowns or Jarstal, which can then immediately recast the 1-drop that we cast, which is just insane, right? If you go turn 1, Attune with Aether, turn 2, Amped Raptor into Minsk and Boo, and you get a 2-1 and a Minsk and Boo on turn 2, that's the game over, right? Very, very few decks are going to be able to beat that. Now, obviously there's inconsistency here, right? If you don't have one of these on turn 1 and you cast the Amped Raptor on turn 2, if you hit one of your 3 or 4 drops, that's going to be a whiff. Additionally, if you do have one of these and you hit Amped Raptor, there's obviously a bunch of smaller cards that we can hit as well, but I think the fail rate is going to be pretty low, right? With 12 of these effects, you're much more likely to find one of these before you find your first Amped Raptor, in which case the energy will already be in the bank, and then you can just go off with it. And then even if you do draw Amped Raptor without one of these, we have a very high density of 2 mana and 1 mana cards that it can hit as well. So the only way that this could whiff is if you don't have one of these on turn 1, and then on turn 2 you happen to hit one of your 12 whiffs, which is going to suck, but I think the ceiling on this card is worth having that small fail rate, if that makes sense. So let's have a look at what's going on with the rest of the deck. So obviously these are just main enablers for the Amped Raptor, but they're fine cards on their own. Flashing them back with Jarstal is also, just nice value. These cards are also just nice to get in the graveyard early to guarantee that we have something in the graveyard to use with Jarstal, which is pretty nice. But outside of that, we obviously have some very powerful cards like Oko, Minsk and Boo, and Jarstal that we want to cast early. So I like running Delighted Halfling here. I'm running Halfling over Deathrite Shaman because I think the encounterable is going to be very important, right? Being able to give your Jarstal, your Oko, your Minsk and Boo uncounterable against decks running mana drain seems like it's worth the upgrade, or it's worth running over Deathrite Shaman in my opinion. And then the other threats that are running in the deck, Questing Druid and Tarmogoyf, I felt like the risk with running a Teamer deck is that you don't have great ways to disrupt combo decks. And so I feel like you just want to... And also, for Amped Raptor to be effective, I think you want to just try and get stuff onto the battlefield and just apply pressure as quickly as possible. So I wanted this deck to be, be able to just put the opponent on a clock as quickly as possible. And I think Tarmogoyf and Questing Druid are really good ways of doing that. Particularly just going Amped Raptor into one of these on turn 2 and then just cast one of your powerful 3-drops or a removal spell on turn 3 is just going to apply a ton of pressure really quickly, which then should also improve those more difficult matchups against the combo decks, for example, because we are running blue. Typically against combo decks you could run counter spells, but obviously since this deck is built around Amped Raptor, you don't want to run counter spells because counter spells are whiffs when you're kind of cascading off it, if that makes sense. But I still think you can have good matchups against combo just running proactive cards, right? The way I've built the sideboard here is with hate cards that we've got Alpine Moon against Titanfield, which isn't a catch-all answer, obviously, because Titan can shoot her up Blast Zone, which can kill it, but that's kind of slow. So Alpine Moon hopefully slows them down enough for your early pressure to get there. Damping Sphere against the Storm-based combos, Pithing Needle against, combos like Yawgmoth that go off with activated abilities. So I have faith that there's enough good permanent-based combo hate that once the metagame settles and we know what combo decks we need to be able to beat, there should be proactive cards that we can use to beat combos. And most of the combo hate as well is 1 or 2 mana, right? Stuff like Disruptor Flute, stuff like Pithing Needle. By the way, the reason I'm running Pithing Needle over Disruptor Flute is just because I built this list before Disruptor Flute was spoiled. So again, another change I'd make going forwards is just replacing Needle with Disruptor Flute. But basically all of the good early permanent base hate is 1 or 2 mana, and we can find it more consistently off the Amped Raptor as well. So this is another deck that I'm really excited to try out. I am a little bit worried about the design on Amped Raptor though. I think it's going to be such a feels bad when the opponent does go Attune with Aether into Amped Raptor into Minsk and Boo and just wins the game on the spot, as opposed to going Amped Raptor into like another Attune with Aether, for example. But in terms of raw power level, this deck seems like it could have crazy fast starts. So this is another one super excited to try out. So next up we got Lurrus Domain Zoo. So this is how I'm going to be building Domain Zoo initially, and this is another deck that is built around Amped Raptor. This is one of the first decks that I built when I saw Amped Raptor because I think Amped Raptor is super easy to enable in a Lurrus deck because all you have to do is not run counter spells and not run cards that cost 3 or more. And I think Domain Zoo is one of the best homes to use it fairly in this way because the deck has so many powerful 2-drops that you want to be getting out consistently. Stuff like Territorial Carvu, stuff like Nashiba Brawler, stuff like Breakout and Tribal Flames as well. So just using Amped Raptor fairly without any other energy enablers, Domain Zoo seems like the best home for that for sure. Now, like I said, you do give up some cards. You have to give up Leyline Binding, for example, which is a cost, but you know, I think this particular build of the deck is going to be super aggressive to the point where you can probably just attack around the opponent's permanents rather than needing to remove them. And then the other card that you need to cut is the Counterspell. That the name is eluding me for some reason, the Ferocious Counterspell. And that is a cost because it does make you worse against combo and control. But I think a fairly easy swap is just cutting it for Thoughtseize. And I actually think Thoughtseize is potentially better in Zoo anyway, because Zoo is a deck that is typically very stacked at the 2-drop slot and doesn't run that many 1-drops. So having Thoughtseize another proactive 1-mana play might fix curve issues where the counterspell is obviously you have to hold on to it later into the game anyway. So I think that's a fairly easy swap there as well. And just in general, I think Amped Raptor is going to speed up the deck a lot, right? Going Amped Raptor on turn 2 into Nashiba Brawler or Carvu or Tribal Flames or Breakout especially is going to be busted, right? You go Amped Raptor into Breakout, into Territorial Carvu and attack immediately. That's going to be so powerful. Now, obviously there is some anti-synergy going on here because if you hit an Amped Raptor off the Breakout, that's going to be rough because you don't get you get the 2 energy, but you don't get the cascade sort of effects. But with this many creatures, I feel like it should be fairly rare that Amped Raptor is the only card, and I feel like, you know, it's worth that anti-synergy running this card because, you know, like I said, Amped Raptor into Breakout is so powerful, and we have a bunch of other really powerful creatures to be able to hit as well. Speaking of which, another new card that we've got here is a Johnny Cattle Pride. Now, this card seems very generically powerful for me, but I was struggling to find a home for it because getting 2 bodies, a 1/2 and a 2/1 for 2 mana, that's pretty good on rate anyway. But you know, you ideally want to flip this, and it's difficult to know how to do that. You know, if you're running sacrifice outlets, that doesn't really work very well with what a Johnny wants to be doing as a card. So I think this card works best in an aggressive shell where you can take advantage of both creatures, because obviously, you know, getting 2 creatures on the board is going to make combat more difficult for the opponent. And sometimes you're going to be forced the opponent to block as well, right? If you can force the opponent to block, then this flips, and aggressive decks are obviously going to be the best at forcing blocks as well. The other really nice synergy going on here as well is that both Wild Cattle and Nashiba Brawler are cats as well. So that's really big, especially Nashiba Brawler, because this is often a must-kill threat. So if you go to Johnny into a Nashiba Brawler or the other way around, and the opponent has like a lightning bolt in their hand and they have to kill the Brawler, if they do that, the Ajani flips. And then if they prioritize killing the Ajani instead, then the Nashiba Brawler often lives and you get to attack them down with a 5/3 trample. So I really like this synergy. I think this is going to be a really nice upgrade to the deck. I think Ajani is one of the most powerful creatures that we're getting in this set. And I think Zoo is probably the main archetype that can just make the best immediate use of it as well. Outside of Amped Raptor, this is also a deck that is built around Breakout, right? I'm running a lot of creatures here, and because of Breakout and because of Amped Raptor, not only being able to find Breakout, but also being able to hit other 1 and 2 mana creatures, I've decided to run an all-creature sideboard here. So not only can we find all of these cards off Amped Raptor, we can also find them off Breakout, which enables us to find them more consistently. So we've got Haywire Might here as answers to Blood Moon, which seems really big. We've got Juggernaut Peddler as more hand hate. We got Bowmasters against the Brainstorm decks and Remorseful Cleric as graveyard hate, all of which we can find off Breakout, all of which we can find off Amped Raptor to be able to find them more consistently. So this is another one that I'm really excited to try out, and this does seem like it could potentially be one of the fastest aggro decks in the format. So next up, we got a couple decks that utilize the new card Planegenesis. So I briefly talked about this when I was talking about Show and Tell, but I think this is a card that multiple decks could be interested in because it's basically, you know, a way to ramp on turn 2 that can then dig towards stuff later in the game. So I think especially combo decks that want acceleration are really going to value this. And the first one that I think can really benefit from this is Wilderness Reclamation, because, you know, this is obviously a deck that wants to be getting your 3rd land into play going into your turn 3 so that you can cast Wilderness Reclamation on turn 3 and then untap with 4 mana going into the opponent's turn, which is super powerful. So this provides us with some good acceleration. And then compared to Growth Spiral, you basically have to run a pretty high land count for it to consistently ramp you, and then just drawing a card once you have Wilderness Reclamation in play isn't that great. Whereas once you have all this extra mana of Wilderness Reclamation, you can then use Planegenesis to dig towards your more high impact cards, which is going to be especially useful if you're running the more combo versions of the deck. If you're running the versions with 4 Nexus of Fate, for example, this is really great because you can ramp into your Reclamations early and then use this to dig towards your Nexus of Fates once you have all the excess mana. Now, having said that, I've been returning to the deck recently, and I found the Nexus of Fate builds kind of clunky. The big issue there is that for your late game to work, you really need to be running 4 Nexus of Fate to consistently be able to loop them. But Nexus of Fate is just such an awkward card to draw early in the game. So what I've been having more success with recently is basically just a control version of Reclamation that just runs Nexus of Fate as a one-off to give you inevitability in the late game, right? Once you have a ton of mana and your deck size is getting smaller as the game goes on, it's easy to just loop Nexus. Well, not easy, but like once you go to the late game, it's not unreasonable for you to start looping just your one-of, and your overall card quality is much higher because you don't have to run 4 copies of it, for example. The other reason why I've also returned to Wilderness Reclamation is because I think it's one of the decks that can utilize mana drain the best. So obviously mana draining an opponent's spell and then using the excess mana going into your turn 3 to cast Reclamation is incredibly strong as well. But I think another card that works very well with mana drain is Shark Typhoon, because not only does mana drain enable you to hard cast this fairly early on in the game, which is basically impossible for a lot of decks to beat, but you can also just use the excess mana to cycle this, get a big threat, and then still have mana to interact with the opponent. Now, my big issue with Shark Typhoon and mana drain decks is that this card kind of sucks when you don't have mana drain, right? It's pretty inefficient, it dies to Bowmasters, but I think the exception to that is specifically in Wilderness Reclamation, because Shark Typhoon is a really efficient way for you to utilize the excess mana you get off Reclamation. Either, like I said, to hardcast it, but most of the time to just float the mana during your end step, cycle the Shark Typhoon to make a big blocker or attacker, and then still have mana open to defend yourself as well. So I think specifically in Reclamation, Shark Typhoon works well with both Reclamation and mana drain, which makes it a lot less clunky to run. And then, like I said, I think Planegenesis is going to be a really big upgrade to this archetype. So this is another one that I'm really excited to try. And then the other combo deck that I think Planegenesis is going to be really useful in is Creativity. So Creativity is obviously another deck that wants to be getting your third land into play going into your turn 3, because then, you know, you can play a red fetch, crack it for Dwarven Mine, and then use Creativity to get a big creature into play on turn 3, which is really big. And then, like I said previously, you know, the only real options that we've had to enable this in the past is stuff like Growth Spiral and Explore, which, like I said, you need to run a much higher land count, and then once you have lands in play, just drawing a card is pretty bad. And then, you know, the only other option is ramp like into the north, which is just really bad in the mid to late game. So Planegenesis in decks like Creativity and Reclamation are going to be really nice at accelerating into your game plan without reducing overall card quality, because Planegenesis is going to be really good in the mid to late game when you're trying to find your creativities, because looking 4 deep is a lot better than drawing a card off something like Growth Spiral, for example. So again, I'm not sold that Creativity is going to be that good going into the format. I think Reclamation is probably the more generically powerful deck out of the two, mainly because we don't have Archon of Cruelty. If we had Archon instead of Atraxa, I'd be much higher on it, but if you are a Creativity fan, I think Planegenesis is definitely going to be a big upgrade for the deck. I'm just not sure it's going to make Creativity tier 1, for example. So next up, we got a really sweet one, and this is Primal Prez combo. So if you've not seen this card, 4 mana enchantment, gets 2 energy, and then you can cast creatures with mana value 3 or less by paying an energy instead of their mana cost. So even discarding combos, this seems like a pretty decent card to play fairly, especially in Historic, right? Playing this for 4 mana and then getting to cast 2 3-drops for essentially for free, very powerful. And then ideally, if you're using this fairly, you would want to run other energy enablers that enable you to do it. You know, especially good if you can chain cards together like Recruit of the Guard or Goblin Matron that search other cards. But like I said, we're trying to combo off with this card, and it works incredibly well with Guide of Souls, because Guide of Souls is basically strict upgrade on Soul Warden. So if you're running a deck that wants Soul Warden like a Malia combo or Heliod combo in Historic, for example, straight upgrade there. But in this particular deck, if you have this in play and you cast a creature with Primal Prez, you get an energy back immediately, which then enables you to cast another creature. So if you have creatures that you can loop, this enables you to do kind of degenerate infinite loops, which is pretty sick. So in my opinion, the best way to use this is with Ominous Traveler, because I'm sure if you've played with Historic or Alchemy in the past, you know how this card works. I've covered Historic and Alchemy variants of Ominous Traveler combo on this channel, so if you've been around for a while, you probably know how this works. If you don't, basically the way this works is, if you have a way to loop Ominous Traveler, you can go Ominous Traveler, get a card from the spellbook, bounce Ominous Traveler, cast it again, and then as part of the spellbook, you get Champion of the Peris, which is a zombie that grows, and you can get Dominating Vampire, which can steal all of your opponent's creatures, and then also give your Champion of the Perished haste to be able to attack for lethal. So if you can infinitely loop Ominous Traveler, you can just win no matter what. And in this particular deck, like I said, we got Primal Prayer's Guide of Souls. So the way it works with this combo is we go Ominous Traveler, get an energy back, get a card off the spellbook, cast a spellbook card, Ominous Traveler goes back to our hand, the spellbook card enters the battlefield, gets an energy back, and then we can just keep looping Ominous Traveler and the spellbook cards over and over again to basically do that loop I said where we get Champion of the Perished, steal all the opponent's creatures, give your Champion of the Perished haste, and then attack for lethal. Now, if you've played with this combo in the past, you know that timing out can be an issue, right? You need to play incredibly quickly with this combo because Arena has a hard 5-minute time limit for each player's turn, so even if you're taking actions really quickly, you can time out. Now, I'm less concerned about that with this particular variant of the combo, because compared to the last iteration we had in Historic, you don't need to generate mana, right? The previous version was having to use Ashnod's Altar to sacrifice your spellbook creatures to produce mana. This version of the combo doesn't do that. And then additionally, Guide of Souls can give your creature flying. So if the opponent doesn't have any creatures with flying or reach, you don't need to steal the opponent's creatures. You can just give your Champion of the Perished haste, and then also give it flying off Guide of Souls to attack for lethal. So I think timing out should be less of an issue with this particular variant of the combo. So let's have a look at the other cards. So first of all, you know, with previous versions of Ominous Traveler, Cabaretti Revels has been a very powerful card. So I'm really excited to try Revels out in this particular build, because if we have Primal Prayers and Revels in play and we cast the Ominous Traveler, we're guaranteed to hit Guide of Souls, which just enables us to combo off immediately, which is really strong. And then additionally, we have a bunch of other creatures that work really well with the Revels. So we got Recruiter of the Guard, which can tutor for whichever piece we miss. So if we have Revels in play and we go Recruiter of the Guard, we'll hit either Ominous Traveler or Guide of Souls. Then Recruiter enters the battlefield and we can just tutor whichever piece we didn't hit, which seems pretty powerful. I think Cabaretti Revels also works incredibly well with the pitch elementals, because it's another way that we can turn evoking the elementals into card neutral, and that could be a separate deck that I've, not even had time to Theorycraft yet, right? You could run Revels alongside the pitch elementals and maybe up the Beanstalk, and then when you evoke them, you trigger Revels, and then you could run stuff like Risen Reef, which then turns the elementals into card advantage. But that's that's another deck that we'll get to at some point, hopefully. But yeah, Revels in this list seems pretty nice with Solitude. Oh, by the way, also Solitude outside of the mana base is the only card in this list that isn't Historic legal. So I think this archetype should be fairly easy to port over to Historic, and it could even be better there because Historic is obviously going to be lower power level overall. The other concern I've got with this particular list with Revels, I think there's a fairly good chance that the best version of Primal Prayers combo doesn't run Revels. And one reason for that is that the creature count isn't insanely high in this list, right? One issue I've had from playing Revels in the past is that you can end up in these spots where you cast the Revels and then you just don't have any creatures to trigger it, which is a nightmare, right? Revels can be 3 mana, do nothing if you don't have a pitch elemental immediately, so that could be one reason. But we do have cards like Witch Enchanter, which improves it, as well as a Malevolent Rebel that I'll get to in a second. But Witch Enchanter is really nice, and if you're running Revels, I think the creature untapped NDFCs are worth considering as ways to get your creature count higher. So this is basically an untapped land that we can pay 3 life to put into play, or a 4 mana disenchant. So this is just a very easy way for us to up the creature count without having to cut much else, because this is obviously a land for the mana base as well. So like I said, it's just another creature that we can cast when we have Revels in play, but it's also nice because we can tutor off Recruiter of the Guard if we need to kill an artifact or enchantment, or if we need a land drop, right? So if we have a Recruiter of the Guard and we have the combo, but we don't have the 4th land for Primal Prayers, we can just use Recruiter of the Guard to tutor up an untapped land, which is pretty nice. And then additionally, it's also a card that we can pitch to Solitude as well. So I think cards like Witch Enchanter are going to be really useful, especially in decks where you need extra cards for pitch elementals, you need extra creatures for Revels, you want extra tutor targets for Recruiter of the Guard, for example. As I was talking about, another new card that I think is going to be a really nice addition to Primal Prayers decks is Malevolent Rumble, which not only helps you find Primal Prayers, but it also provides you a way to ramp into it as well, which is pretty nice. And then, like I said, we are running a relatively low creature count compared to most Revels decks, but if we have Revels in play, we can use Malevolent Rumble to tutor a creature to trigger the Revels, and then the spawn that we create can be sacked immediately to cast that creature, help us cast the creature early if we don't have the mana for it. And then I'm also running Commune with Spirits to be able to find our key enchantments quicker as well. So again, this is one where I feel like Revels might not be the best way to build it, but I think this core of Primal Prayers, Guide of Souls, Ominous Traveler is going to be really strong, especially because I think Primal Prayers and Guide of Souls are just generically good cards on their own. Ominous Traveler is in theory, a generically powerful card on its own. In Timeless and Historic, it's just really slow. But the fact that 2 of your 3 combo pieces are good on their own is such a big boost to consistency in these sorts of combo decks. So this is another one that I'm really excited to try out. Then the sideboard, we've got a lot of 1 of tutor targets for the Recruiter of the Guard, which is pretty nice. Giant Killer for removal. Graveyard Hate. White Orchid Phantom is another new card that we're getting in this set that seems very nice, especially against Ugin's Labyrinth decks as a way to kill their land and get rid of the card they imprinted. We got Lavinia for Show and Tell, Elite Spellbinder for combo, Skyclave Apparition for removal, and then Tajik can be tutored off Recruit of the Guard. You know, I love for this to be good because I think Tajik is really sweet. If the opponent doesn't have Exile-based removal, like if you play this against Scam, this seems like a nightmare for them to deal with, honestly. And then we've obviously got Swords to Plowshares as extra removal. So, Primal Price combo, probably the archetype that is going to look very different to this. I think this sort of combo deck is going to be one of those decks that takes a lot of iterations to figure out, but I think this deck has the potential to be really strong, especially in Historic where the relative power level is lower. So next up we got this Sultai midrange deck, kind of built around this new card Sorin of House Markov. So like the Ajani we saw earlier, this is a cheap creature that we can flip into a Planeswalker, and this seems really nice in Sultai alongside both Uro and Oko Thief of Crown. So the idea here is that we do whatever on turn 1, you know, maybe Grief Scam with Reanimate, maybe just cast a Deathrite Shaman or a Thoughtseize if we're post-sideboard. Then on turn 2, we can cast Sorin of House Markov, and then ideally on turn 3, we cast Uro, which gains us 3 life, immediately flipping Sorin into the Planeswalker side, and then if the opponent has a creature, we can use the -1 to deal 3 damage to one of their creatures, so immediately works as a removal spell. If they don't, we can just start plussing to create food tokens and getting towards the -6, which seems really nice. And this just seems really solid, you know, just a really solid way to flip the Planeswalker. Sorin is also just a decent creature early on to be able to block and, you know, shut the game out against decks, opponents running stuff like Ragavan. Having 4 toughness means it doesn't die to bolt as well. Then outside of Uro, we also have Oko, which I think works very well with it. Now, it doesn't flip it immediately, but if we go Sorin on turn 2, into Oko on turn 3, +2 to make a food, and like I said, Sorin has decent stats to be able to defend the Oko from the opponent's attackers. Then the following turn, we can just crack the food off the Oko, which then flips the Sorin. Again, we've gained 3 life, so we could immediately use the -1 to kill an opponent's creature, or we can just +2 to make a food, and then we have this pretty sick loop where we can plus the Sorin Ravenous Neonate to make a food, and then plus the Oko to turn that food into an elk, essentially making a 3/3 every single turn, which is going to be almost impossible for any fair deck to beat. Especially because the other modes can then enable us to, you know, once we have Oko to above 5, we can then go plus Sorin make a food, -5 the Oko to trade that food with one of the opponent's creatures. And then the other really nice thing here as well is that the -1 can act as a finisher as well. So you could potentially, you know, stack up a bunch of food once the game's gone long, crack 3 food in a single turn, and then -1 to deal that all that damage to the opponent's face. So these sorts of Sultai midrange decks typically are slow to close the game out, but this -1, in addition to the reach that cards like Deathrite Shaman give, could give the deck kind of like a combo way to finish games out, which is pretty strong because all of the other cards that are running to enable this sort of thing are generically powerful in their own right. So I'm really excited to try Sorin alongside Uro and Oko. You know, the rest of the deck, we've got stuff like, you know, Grief and Reanimate. Excitingly, this is a deck that can run Once Upon a Time alongside Grief, so you maximize your chances of having, you know, this turn 1 scam start. We can also Once Upon a Time to find Troll of Khazad Doom, which, you know, essentially enables us to get the Troll Reanimate package online earlier as well. And then outside of that, we just got generically powerful cards, right? We got Fatal Push, Oko, Uro, Bowmasters, Sorin, Deathrite Shaman, then we got stuff like Thoughtseize and extra removal in the sideboard. So this seems like a card with a lot of really nice cross synergies, a lot of fast starts. We have access to the early Grief starts, we have access to the Troll Reanimate package. Seems like a really well-rounded deck that could be difficult for a lot of decks to beat, especially if they're trying to rely on their fair game plan. So next up we got an archetype that is getting a real boost to consistency, and that is Belcher, and this is for both formats. I think this is going to be a really big deal for Historic as well. Obviously I've only got a Timeless list here as well, but you're not really getting any upgrades to the castable cards or the cards that you proactively want to play in Belcher. The big upgrade here is we're getting a big cycle of MDFCs to the point where you can run entirely untapped lands in your Belcher deck now, which is a huge deal. So again, this is Timeless, but the Historic versions of the deck, just look at old builds and just replace all of the tapped lands with untapped lands. That's the really big upgrade here, and I think that is a very big upgrade because I think, you know, having to play tapped lands does slow the combo down by a whole turn in a lot of scenarios. And so having untapped lands on every single point of the curve is going to be a big boost to not only consistency, but also speed as well. And Belcher is a deck that is all about speed. So This is definitely a big upgrade. Now, another cycle of MDFCs we're getting is a dual land cycle. So you could conceivably run a green-black dual MDFC in the Timeless variant, for example. But the big difference there is that's a tap land. And I think, I'm basically using pre-existing Belcher decks for the rest of the deck. And these decks are already built to be able to convert mana, right? The big issue with single color MDFCs in these particular lists is you need double green for Channel, you need triple black for Beseech the Mirror. And that's the reason why these decks are running, Chromatic Spheres and Stars and Wizard's Rockets to be able to convert green mana into black and vice versa when you need to. So I think these decks are already built to fix that problem. So I think it's not worth running a tapped dual land to try and help those issues, if that makes sense. I think it's just much better to run all untapped lands, and then, like I said, it should just speed up the deck on average by maybe a turn every single game. Probably not that much on average, but it's a really, really big deal for both formats. Now, having said that, in Timeless, obviously Grief is going to be popular, and that's going to be a beating, because getting Grief scammed on turn 1 and then taking both of your lands is going to be absolutely brutal. But having said that, this is a deck that's already running 4 Leyline of Sanctity in the main deck to kind of mitigate that somewhat. But either way, if you're a fan of Belcher, this is really going to improve your speed and consistency in both formats. Then next up, we've got a couple of lists utilizing this new card, the Creation of Avacyn. So this is a really interesting card to me. This seems very powerful, but it does come with pretty significant downsides as well. So 3 mana enchantment, search a card, then exile it face up, and then cheat it into play. So it's a single card that not only tutors for a creature, but also cheats it into play. And this is really big because, unlike Reanimator, where you need to have the target, get it into the graveyard, and then bring it back without the opponent having graveyard hate, or, if you're running Creativity where you can't run any other creatures and the opponent can fizzle it by killing the target in response, this being a self-contained way to get that creature into play seems really, really powerful to me. Now, the two big downsides with this card, though, is that it's a lot slower if you cast this on curve, right? The big advantage of running Reanimation spells and Creativity is you get the creature the turn you play it, right? This, you have to wait 2 turns. Obviously, you can proliferate to get around that, and I know Aspiring Spike's been talking about using the instant speed proliferate, which could potentially mitigate losing life off Chapter 2. I'm not sure if that works, right? The idea is you wait for the Chapter 2 to go on the stack, then you activate the proliferate ability to cheat the creature into play before Chapter 2 resolves, and then there's a chance that you might not lose the life of that. I'm not sure whether that works or not. If there are any judges in the comments, I'd love to hear if you think that works, because it does seem like a weird rules interaction, but proliferating is one way to get around that. The other big upside, though, is that the opponent can obviously kill this before you get to Chapter 3, right? And especially if they wait for you to take damage off Chapter 2, if you are using this to cheat an Attractor into play, and the opponent does have a disenchant, this becomes 3 mana, takes 7 damage, which is, obviously not ideal. So there are real risks to this card, but I think, having a self-contained way to tutor and cheat a creature into play, like I said, is very, very powerful. And I'm very excited to try this one out in Timeless, especially because it's a really powerful play to cheat into play off Dark Ritual. So Dark Ritual, I think, is still my pick for the best card in Timeless. I think it's incredibly strong. I think we've just been starved for good ways to use it. Obviously, Necropotence is one of the best ways to use it, and then more recently we've seen Sorin being good as well. But the difference between Creation of Avacyn and Sorin, obviously, again, you have to wait 2 turns, but Sorin, you need to have another big creature in play, and oftentimes these Dark Ritual decks don't run smaller vampires to utilize it, so I think in terms of consistency of trying to assemble the combo, right, Creation of Avacyn is, to all intents and purposes, a 1-card combo, and the downside of having to wait is really mitigated if you get it into play off turn 1 off a Dark Ritual. So, if we are running Ritual and Creation of Avacyn, I don't think you can run it alongside Necropotence. My experience playing Necropotence decks, which I played quite a lot, is that you really, really want to avoid any effects that lose you life at any cost, basically. You don't want to run Thoughtseize, you don't want to run, Reanimate, and Creation of Avacyn falls under that category as well. So I don't think you want to run Creation of Avacyn alongside Necropotence, but you can still run it alongside Sorin Imperious Bloodlord as just another really powerful play to do on turn 1. And I think Sorin and Creation works pretty well together, because obviously for Sorin to be effective, you want to be running a bunch of expensive, powerful vampires to cheat into play off it. And that means that you can have good targets to play into play with Creation of Avacyn without having to run cards that are bad to draw like Atraxa. Now, having said that, in this list, I am running Reanimate with discard outlets, right? We've got Bitter Triumph here, which can use as a discard outlet. Since we're a mono black deck, we can also afford to run Phyrexian Scrapyard in the mana base, and I think this is a very underrated card that we have on Arena that a lot of people are missing. I think, especially now that we've got Persist in the format that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, if you are running a mono black Reanimator deck, Phyrexian Scrapyard seems such an excellent way to give it a discard outlet at very little cost, right? Fairly low opportunity cost to run this. So you could potentially run, Atraxa in here with Creation of Avacyn with the hopes of using Reanimate to get it back, but you don't need to. That's the point. You can run, 4 Vein Ripper, 4 Saint Lander as reasonable cards to cheat into play off Creation of Avacyn. And then the rest of this list is, nothing too special going on. We've got Grief and Reanimate alongside the Troll of Khazad-dûm, which I think this package is going to be everywhere, right? This is such an easy package to slot into any black mid-range deck. 4 Grief, 4 Troll, 4 Reanimate. Gives you a way to scam Grief on turn 1. Gives you a way to just Reanimate the Troll. And like I said, we've got discard outlets for Vein Ripper and Saint Lander. Then Bitter Triumph, just generically powerful removal spell that also provides us a discard outlet for our Reanimate if we want to bring back a Vein Ripper or Saint Lander. And then I also have another build of this deck that I built first, that's trying to turn the downside of the Creation of Avacyn into an upside with Death Shadow. So Death Shadow, I think, is a card that gets a lot of nice upgrades in this set, particularly because, like I said, the Grief Reanimate package is going to be really popular, and going, Grief Reanimate with Troll is a really nice way to get our life total low enough that we can start applying pressure with Death Shadow very quickly. Thoughtseize obviously a slam dunk, and then you've obviously got Fetch Lands and Shock Lands that you can use to lower your life total for Death Shadow as well. I think Creation of Avacyn is another way that we can do that, right? We can use Creation of Avacyn, deal ourselves 6 or 7 by tutoring like a Vein Ripper, Saint Lander, or a Atraxa if you're running a build without Sorin, for example, and then just get Death Shadow down early, which seems pretty nice. Now, I do have hesitations about whether Death Shadow is going to be that good after MH3. If people run Solitude, right? If Solitude sees play, Solitude is probably going to be running the same deck that Swords to Plowshares is, and both Solitude and Swords to Plowshares are brutal for Death Shadow decks, because if you have Shadowed another creature, they can obviously use Swords or Solitude to exile that creature, gain you life, which can then often kill the Death Shadow as well. But having said that, if Solitude decks and Swords to Plowshares aren't super popular, I still think Shadow is going to be good. And in decks like this, where, it's a 1-drop creature, it's not the end of the world, especially if the rest of the deck is good. Having said that, another reason I'm a little bit more skeptical about Sorin after MH3 is that I think Solitude is really good against Vein Ripper, because Solitude you can evoke, target the Vein Ripper, and then sacrifice the Solitude to the ward cost, which makes it, much more vulnerable than it was previously. But we'll have to see. I still think these are generically powerful cards, and I don't think Solitude and Swords to Plowshares existing in the format should mean these cards don't see play. But yeah, this version of the deck, like I said, more focused around Death Shadow. So we've got 4 Thoughtseize, we've got 4 Reanimate, 4 Creation of Avacyn. Bitter Triumph also becomes really good in this deck, this list compared to the last one as well, because not only is it a discard outlet to be able to reanimate our Vein Rippers and stuff, but it's also a way that we can lose life with the Death Shadow as well, which is a pretty nice synergy. However, having said that, the reason I've put this one above this one on this article is just because I think there's some inconsistency in this list that I'm not sure I really like. First of all, I don't think you can really afford to run Sorin with just 5 vampires. I think you really need to be running more than that, so that's one area that it could be improved. Having said that, I don't know if you need Sorin, but the thing is here, for Creation of Avacyn to be good, I think you want to be running Dark Ritual. The other thing I don't like about this particular list is that without Dark Ritual, you don't have any way to accelerate into Sorin Creation of Avacyn. In this list, you have Deathrite Shaman to be able to do that as well, which is pretty nice for consistency, but there's multiple ways you can build around this. I think this list, out of the two, is probably the more consistent because it's a little bit more focused, but I definitely think Death Shadow alongside Creation of Avacyn is something that should be explored, and maybe you could run the One Ring as another Dark Ritual target and just ditch this Sorin package. Maybe run Reanimate, Troll, with Atraxa and some discard outlets to potentially enable you to reanimate the Atraxa, and then have the One Ring as just another way to utilize your Dark Ritual that also loses you life for the Death Shadow as well. So even though I'm a bit skeptical about Death Shadow, I do definitely want to try it alongside Creation of Avacyn in the Reanimate package. So next up we got Flare of Malice Sacrifice. So Flare of Malice I think is one of the best flares out of the cycle. I think it's contending with the blue and the green one. Now, I think the blue and the green one are better. I think the effect they provide is better, but the big thing that Flare of Malice has got going for it is that black is just the best colour for having non-token creatures to sacrifice, right? Black has recursive creatures like Bloodghast, black has creatures like Grief and the token from Orcish Bowmasters that are easy to sacrifice. So I think Flare of Malice, the effect is nice. I don't think it's quite as powerful as the green or blue one, but it's easier to enable, which definitely counts for something. I think one of the big reasons that I'm not sure Flare of Denial is going to see much play straight away is that I just don't think there's a deck that can consistently get blue creatures in play they want to sacrifice, whereas black decks like this one, especially sacrifice decks where they have recursive black creatures, this is going to be really easy to enable. So like I said, we do have a number of cards that work very well with this. We're a bombardment deck, so Forsaken Miner is pretty nice, and while Flare of Malice doesn't target, sacrificing Miner to it is completely fine, because we do have a lot of other cards that do commit crimes, and we can get this back from the graveyard later in the game. Then Bowmasters, obviously you really don't want to be sacrificing the Bowmasters itself, but you're very happy to sacrifice the Orc token. Bloodghast comes back from the graveyard, which is great, and then Grief is a really big one as well, because you can evoke Grief and then just sacrifice it before it goes to the graveyard to the Flare of Malice, which is pretty nice as well. So this list, obviously just a pretty generic sacrifice shell. We've got Bombardment here, Forsaken Miner is pretty nice, Unlucky Witness, good to provide card advantage. Seasoned Pyromancer, I mean, hasn't really seen much play in Timeless because Bowmasters is still around, but this is a deck with Goblin Bombardment and our own Bowmasters, which is really good at keeping the opponents off the battlefield. Not to mention, both Grief and Fury are really big upgrades. You know, Sacrifice, or specifically Goblin Bombardment, is a deck that didn't really get too many upgrades moving from Historic to Timeless, and for a while in Timeless, Show and Tell was the best deck, so I haven't really tried it much there, but now we're getting Grief and Fury, which are significant upgrades. Oh, by the way, this says Historic, not Timeless. I've messed that up. I'll alter that in the article once I finish recording, but yeah, this is obviously a Timeless list because we got Flare and the Pitch Elementals, but yeah, overall this deck seems very generically powerful. We've got the Grief scam starts with Reanimate here available as well. Reanimate also works very nicely with stuff like Seasoned Pyromancer and Bowmasters. So yeah, this seems like a very generically powerful deck, and I think especially if Grief pushes combo decks out of the format, that's the sort of metagame where a sacrifice deck like this can really excel, because it's great against aggro, it's great against mid-range, and it has really good reach as well, so I'm really excited to try this one out. So next up we got Harbinger Flare Merfolk. So I think Merfolk obviously hasn't really seen much play at all in Timeless, and I think post MH3 as an archetype it's probably going to get even worse because of Fury, but it does get a couple of nice upgrades that I definitely think it's worth trying at least. So like I said, I think Flare of Denial is one of the most powerful flares out the entire cycle, but there are very few decks that can put early non-token blue creatures into play that they want to sacrifice, and I think for Flare of Denial to be good, you really need to be enabling this early, because as the game goes on, you know, you get more and more mana, right? So having a free counter spell as opposed to one that you can just pay for becomes less valuable. So I really do think you need early blue creatures to be able to enable this. And obviously Merfolk is the perfect deck for that, because you have creatures that you're happy to sacrifice, like Shoreline Scout, Silvergill Adept, which this is one thing that I would change since I made this list. I'd probably replace this with the 2-mana Merfolk that's green-blue that produces Explore tokens, because Adept is very rough into Bowmasters, which is obviously still going to be very popular, especially if Scam's about. So that is one change I would make immediately. You just swap this out for the green-blue one that provides you 2 Explores. But you're happy to sacrifice that other creature as well, and Merfolk Trickster. So these are all creatures that you're pretty happy to sacrifice to Flare of Denial. And like I said, I think Fury is going to be a big problem for this deck, and Flare of Denial at least gives you counterplay to that, right? If the opponent evokes a Fury and you Flare of Denial that by sacrificing one of your creatures, that's actually a pretty good exchange for you. And then the other new card that we're getting is Harbinger of the Sea. So this is basically Magus of the Moon in blue, which is a pretty big deal. I think it being in blue is probably better than Magus of the Moon, because it means the red decks can't use lightning bolts to kill it if they don't have a basic, right? There's very little blue interaction if the opponent hasn't fetched their basics around it that can help this. The other thing is that I think, especially with Wintermoon and Harbinger of the Seas entering the format, I think people will learn pretty quickly to run basics and to fetch them early, which does mean that this card is probably likely to be a little less powerful than I'd hope. That's my prediction anyway. But the other really nice thing about this, specifically in Merfolk, is there will be some non-basics the opponent has, and turning them into islands means that Master of the Pearl Trident gives all of your other Merfolk island walk. So this not only works as a way to shut out... where is it? Here we go. Yeah, to not only shut out Field of the Dead and to punish greedy mana bases, but it's also a really good way to just give all your creatures unblockable and close the game out really quickly. So I'm definitely going to be trying this. I think out of all the pitch elementals, or all of the non-green ones, Fury is probably the one... Actually, I was going to say Fury is probably the one that doesn't fit into as many decks, but I think Scam and Up the Beanstalk are going to be 2 of the most popular decks, so maybe that's not true. Maybe Fury is going to be everywhere, in which case this probably isn't going to cut it, but I still think it's worth testing, because I think Flare of Denial and Harbinger are 2 very powerful cards, and Flare in particular, I want to try Merfolk, because this seems very high ceiling to me. So next up we got the first deck that I think is only going to be a best of one player, and that is Dredge. So again, this is a timeless list here, but I'm also going to talk about historic because both of those lists are pretty similar, and there are two new cards that we're going to try out here. First of which is Flare of Denial. So like I said, I think Flare of Denial is one of the most powerful cards being added in this set. There just aren't many decks that can enable it very consistently. And I do think Dredge is one of them because you've got Merfolk Secret Keeper, you've got Narcomoeba and Prized Amalgam, all of which you're very happy to sacrifice. And Dredge as a deck typically doesn't get much interaction because the deck basically is either enablers or stuff that you're happy to mill. And so Flare of Denial giving you protection against whatever the opponent's doing, giving you protection to protect your board from interaction, seems very powerful to me. My big concern with it, though, is that, like I said, Dredge is very high synergy, right? Typically, it's either enablers or stuff that you mill. If you cut enablers for this, it makes your proactive game plan a little bit less consistent. And if you cut payoffs for it, it makes your mill cards less consistent because you're going to be milling over Flare of Denials instead of extra Silver Smoke Ghouls or Wonders or whatever. However, the other new card that I think could try and change that dynamic slightly is Ripples of Undeath. So this is a 2-mana enchantment at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, so you do have to wait a turn. You mill 3 cards, and then you can pay 1 and 3 life. If you do, you put a card from those into your hand. So that is not only great at helping you find more enablers, right? So I think this card could also be worth trying in the historic variants as well, because you can play this, and then if you mill over a Glimpse of the Unthinkable, you can just put that into your hand and just keep milling yourself, right? And in that way, you make it a lot more likely that you're going to be able to be quicker because you can find more mill spells. And it also makes it much less likely that you're going to run out of gas. I think one of the big issues with Dredge is that you oftentimes have to mulligan down to a Glimpse of the Unthinkable, and then, maybe another card like another Boldly Gaze, and then you just run out of gas. Whereas Ripples of Undeath is going to be milling you to enable your proactive game plan, but is also good at helping you find more glimpses and find more, Stitches supplies and stuff like that. But specifically in Timeless, it also makes it much more consistent that you can find your Flare of Denial. So you mill yourself to enable your graveyard synergies, and then if you mill over a Flare of Denial with the Ripples, you can just put it into your hand, and then again, you don't need mana for it, right? You can just cast it for free as long as you have a non-token blue creature. So I'm really excited to try these two together. Again, I think this deck is just way too all-in on the graveyard to be viable in best of 3. I think Graveyard Hate is going to be a staple in sideboards, particularly with Persist coming in this set. I think Reanimator could be a very real deck. So I think there's probably going to be too much Graveyard Hate in both formats for this to be viable in best of 3. But if you're a best of 1 player, I think this is definitely a deck that's worth trying out in both formats. So next up we got Tamiyo Wizard's Control. So one card in Timeless that hasn't really had a chance to shine is Flame of Anor. So this is obviously one of the best cards in Historic, and I do think this is absolutely a Timeless power level card. There just hasn't really been a good shell to enable it. So we are getting a few new wizards in this set that could potentially help that. First of which is Tamiyo Inquisitive Student. So this is another one of those creatures that can flip into a Planeswalker, and this one seems pretty good to me. I think, you play this, you start attacking, you generate card advantage, and then obviously in Timeless this is going to be fairly easy to flip with Brainstorm, but even without Brainstorm, you could run Mishra's Bauble and then go, Tamiyo Bauble, crack the Bauble to draw during your turn, attack, you draw for turn, and then you can crack the Clue again, which flips it. So I think it's going to be fairly easy to flip in Timeless. In terms of the homes for this, I have thought about other shells with Wizards, right? The main reason that Is It Wizards, the Historic deck isn't really viable in Timeless is because we don't have the buffed version of Symmetry Sage, and I don't think Tamiyo fits in that sort of shell. I think this is very much a control card, right? You play this on turn 1, you have a bunch of counter spells and interactions to keep the opponent off the board, keep attacking with this to get clue tokens, and then the Planeswalker side also seems like a control tool to me as well, right? The +2 protects you and your Planeswalkers, which again is a control ability, and then the -3 to rebuy instants and sorceries, again, most useful in a control deck where you can rebuy your counter spells and your Flame of Anors and stuff like that. So basically, I've built a control deck here. We got Tamiyo, we got Snapcaster Mage is another wizard that works very well in the control shell. Same thing with Tashana's Tidebinder, another wizard that is, very useful, especially against decks like Primeval Titan. And this is another deck where I'm also trying Harbinger of the Seas because it's a wizard as well. So it's another way that we can trigger Flame of Anor. It's another good tool to try and knock the opponent out of the game. Now, having said that, there are a few issues with running Harbinger in this sort of deck. First of all, these sorts of decks, especially Is It Control, wants to be running Mystic Sanctuary, but for Harbinger of the Seas not to lock you out of casting red spells, you need to be running a basic mountain at the very least, and a lot of red fetch lands, and running a basic mountain in this deck where you need double blue on turn 2 for mana draining counterspell is a little bit awkward, and then obviously if you fetch for your mountain early and then you draw the Mystic Sanctuary, that doesn't really work either. So not running Mystic Sanctuary in this list, and I am running a lot of red fetches and the mountain. And like I said, I don't know if Harbinger of the Seas is really going to be that good, to be honest, because Fury Solitude kills it. You know, it gives the opponent a good target for your removal, although I guess we're also running Tamiyo, which, you know, is a relatively good target for the opponent's kill. So there's a chance the Harbinger might not be good enough, but I still think, right, you could just cut the Harbingers, run 4 Tidebinder, and then just, you know, run a couple of extra counter spells or something, and then it's good. But it's definitely worth trying, right? I do think Harbinger is worth looking at even outside of Merfolk in a list like this that can utilize the wizard part of it, or maybe just in the sideboard of blue decks, because this is another big upgrade. You know, non-red decks don't get the Blood Moon style effect, whereas now with Harbinger, any blue deck can get this. So especially against the Primeval Titan deck, these control decks getting access to Harbinger of the Seas seems like a nice upgrade for the sideboard there. But yeah, outside of that, the rest of the deck, nothing too crazy going on here, right? We've got counterspells, interaction. Galvanic Discharge here, I think, is the next best interaction in red outside of Lightning Bolt if you can't get Delirium online. I still think Unholy Heat is probably better in decks that can get Delirium online, but in a list like this where we don't really want to be running Mishra's Bauble and it's not particularly easy to get Delirium online, Galvanic Discharge basically works as a Lightning Bolt that can't go face, and if you do use it to kill a smaller creature, then future copies of Galvanic Discharge can kill bigger creatures because you've got energy stored up as well. So definitely consider this even not in energy decks if you're in red for your removal and you don't enable Delirium very easily. And then sideboard, you know, nothing too crazy going on here either. But yeah, very excited to try this one out. I do think Flame of Honor is a very underplayed card in Timeless, and I think at least Tamiyo should be another good enabler for it. So as I mentioned a few times, we're also getting Persist in this set, which is a really big deal for full Reanimator deck. So obviously we got Reanimate recently, but the reason that a full Reanimator deck hasn't really been viable is just that for your proactive game plan to be consistent enough, you need to be running more than just 4 reanimation spells, and the next best alternatives were just nowhere near as good, right? Priest of Fell Rites is too vulnerable to interaction, Victimize is too difficult to set up, and Unbury Rites is just too expensive. So getting Persist as another good quality, efficient reanimation spell is a really big deal for Reanimator as a full archetype. And then additionally, as I mentioned a few times, the package of Grief, Reanimate, Troll of Khazad-dûm fits so cleanly into a lot of black decks that you could just run a decent, you know, mid-range core that also happens to enable a reanimation game plan. Now, the awkward thing about Persist in Timeless is that we don't have Archon of Cruelty, so Atraxa is like the premier creature you would want to cheat into play, but it being legendary means that it doesn't work with Persist, unfortunately. And then, you know, traditionally Gristlebrand is another one. Obviously that becomes a lot worse with Orcish Banemasters being added, but in Timeless, I think the best option that we have to bring back with Persist is Serra's Emissary, but the non-legendary clause on this does limit the options that we have. If Archon of Cruelty was legal, I think like Rescaminator, as some people call it, would be really busted, right? You run Archon, some discard outlets, Persist, Reanimate, Grief, Troll of Khazad-dûm. If you did want to run full Reanimate, I do think Serra's Emissary is still a decent target, right? It's going to be good against a lot of decks. Certain decks are really going to struggle to beat it as well, and then it does turn the corner pretty quickly. Obviously, it gets a -1/-1 counter, but what I'm trying in this particular list is running it alongside Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, which already wants to be running Vein Ripper, which seems like a pretty reasonable creature to reanimate, right? Vein Ripper, even off the Persist -1/-1 counter, the passive is really good. We've seen this be powerful enough to close games out in Timeless, so I'm excited to try it. I'm also running Westgate Regent as like the next best non-legendary creature that we can cheat into play off the Sorin and also Persist, because I do think, you know, there's maybe an argument to be made that, oh, you can just run Atraxa for Reanimate anyway, but the whole reason that we're running stuff like Troll of Khazad-dûm and Grief is so that we've got good stuff for Reanimate. I think Atraxa not working with Persist does make it a little bit awkward. The annoying thing with this package that I've got going on here, though, is that I think Westgate Regent is pretty awkward with Persist, right? The Westgate Regent, like Vein Ripper, does have some inherent protection against removal, which is pretty big, and it turns the corner very quickly, right? If you go Dark Ritual into Sorin, and then you -3 to put Westgate Regent into play, you can start clocking the opponent very quickly, but it scales based on its power. And so using Persist to, you know, reanimate Westgate Regent not only slows down the ability for you to close out the game, but it also means that it can be killed by Lightning Bolt, which is a concern. So I actually think that if I was going to build this list, I would maybe, I don't know what the right solution is, because, well, first of all, if you think there's a non-legendary vampire that I'm missing, definitely let me know in the comments, because that would be such an easy swap, right? If there's just another Vein Ripper-esque non-legendary vampire that I've missed, that would be perfect. Then we have 8 creatures that we can cheat into play off Sorin, that we can also reanimate and Persist. That would kind of solve the whole issue. One other thing you could consider is maybe running Saint Elenda here instead of Westgate Regent, but then you run into the same issue you have with Atraxa, where you can't persist it. So it'll be interesting to figure it out. I definitely think that this will be good enough to run a full Reanimator deck if you wanted to, but maybe it's best to try and figure out a way to consistently use this with Seri's Emissary, and then you've got Grief and Troll of Khazad-dûm as kind of alternatives as well. But either way, I'm very excited. I also built this deck before the creation of Avacyn was spoiled, so you could maybe run that as well, right? You run Dark Ritual, Sorin, creation of Avacyn, vampires. That, you know, it's hard to fit everything in, but there's a lot of really powerful moving pieces within those decks that also have some decent cross synergy. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if a, you know, Dark Ritual black deck with Sorin, creation of Avacyn, some reanimation spells is really powerful. Again, this is another list where I think Phyrexian Scrapyard is really good, especially if you're running persistent and mono black shells. Seems really good to me. And we've got some other discard outlets, again, running Bitter Triumph here. We've got Collective Brutality is another option, you know, especially against control decks as a way to get rid of their counter spells and discard your reanimation targets, because obviously Bitter Triumph, you know, you need a target to be able to use it. But either way, I definitely think there's something here. Probably not with Westgate Regent, but, you know, there's definitely something here for sure. Then next up, we're moving into the last couple of timeless lists, and these are more speculative ones for sure. And this deck list is pretty wild. Like, I would love for this to be good, but there's a lot of this is basically a very all-in deck with a lot of stuff going on. So again, this is another deck that is very all-in on the graveyard. So I think it's probably going to be exclusively best of one. But the main card that is enabling this deck here is Buried Alive. So Buried Alive, very powerful card. This could enable some really powerful synergies. In Timeless, I don't think we've really got that many uses for it outside of Arclight Phoenix. You know, the best next thing I could think of was maybe, you know, you put a reanimation target in Priest of Fell Rites in your graveyard, but that doesn't come online until turn 5. You know, if Priest of Fell Rites could unearth for 4 mana, then maybe that could be worth looking at. But I think the main use here is going to be using Buried Alive to pitch 3 Arclight Phoenixes into the graveyard. So obviously in Timeless, we don't have free spells outside of Surgical Extraction, right? We don't have good, generically powerful, proactive free spells like Gut Shot or Manamorphose. Obviously, you could run Surgical Extraction in your main deck, which we are running here as like a tutor target, but I think that's a trap for the most part, right? Surgical, if the opponent isn't running stuff you want to hit in the graveyard, or, you know, stuff that you want to discard and then hit in the graveyard, is a liability. Like, I think just using it as a free spell seems pretty bad to me. But we do have ways that we can potentially pitch 3 Phoenixes to the graveyard and get them back on turn 1 in Timeless by going Strike It Rich into Dark Ritual into Buried Alive. That's 3 spells, 3 Phoenixes into the graveyard, 3 Phoenixes coming back on turn 1. That's super powerful for sure. The awkward thing there is that Dark Ritual, you know, in a Phoenix deck, it's hard to find other uses for this, right? You can obviously run stuff like Thoughtseize, which you can use with it. And then, like I said, it's obviously great to ramp into Buried Alive early, but Phoenix typically wants to be running red and blue spells. There aren't really many black spells that can help you counter and get stuff back. So for Dark Ritual to be worth running, you really need to have at least one other use for it. So in this list, I'm going to try it alongside the creation of Avacyn. So not only can we go Dark Ritual into Buried Alive, but we also got Dark Ritual into creation of Avacyn with a couple of Atraxes here as well. So we've got another good turn 1 play. And then also, because we want to be running Strike It Rich to enable the Strike It Rich Ritual Buried Alive line, Strike It Rich also enables us to cast creation of Avacyn on turn 2 as well, which is pretty big. Again, weakness with this card is it's slow, so getting it down early is pretty impactful. And then, like I said, this sort of deck is probably just best of one, and these sorts of decks that are all about mulliganing a little bit till you get a fast start and then just going crazy are what I think a lot of best of one decks, or these sorts of decks tend to thrive much more in best of one, where fast starts are more important, if that makes sense. So obviously running creation of Avacyn and Atraxa doesn't work too well with the Phoenix game plan, but I'm also running discard outlets like Faithless Looting to be able to get Phoenixes into the graveyard that we draw. And because we're running Atraxa with discard outlets like Faithless Looting, I also want to run Reanimate as a way to get Atraxa back from the graveyard if we happen to, you know, draw Faithless Looting and Atraxa together. But obviously, since Atraxa is only a 2-of and it's the only creature that we really want to reanimate outside of maybe Ox of Agonis, I'm only running this as a 1-of with 4 gambles to be able to tutor it. So if we open with Atraxa Looting Gamble, we can go turn 1 losing Atraxa into the graveyard, turn 2 Gamble for Reanimate, and then Reanimate Atraxa as another line. And then Gamble, I don't think, like, I'm usually a big hater of this card. Its card disadvantage and the risk is very high on this card as well. But in this particular list, we have a number of cards that we don't mind discarding that we would probably want to actively tutor, like Arclight Phoenix and like especially Ox of Agonis. Gambling for Ox of Agonis, especially if we have a Faithless Looting in hand, is pretty nice. If you draw Gamble as your last card in hand, you can gamble for Ox of Agonis, immediately pitch it to the graveyard and escape it. So Gamble, not a card I'm normally high on, but in this particular list where we have a lot of cards that we want to discard to the graveyard, I think it's at least worth trying. And then you can find your Reanimate if you need. You can also use it to find Surgical Extraction if you need Graveyard Hate, or if you need a third spell for Phoenix, right? I imagine there'll be situations where you have Phoenixes in the graveyard and you cast 2 spells, one of them including Gamble, but you don't have a spare mana. You can gamble for Surgical, use the Surgical as your third spell, and then get back the Phoenixes as well. And then outside of that, we got Bolt for interaction, we got Looting to get Phoenixes and Atraxes and Ox of Agonis into the graveyard, we got Thoughtseize, some interaction. So again, this deck is super, super all-in. There's a lot of moving parts, and there are definitely some red flags for inconsistency here, right? We've got Dark Ritual, but only 8 cards that actually work with it. We've got multiple game plans, some of which the setup cards don't really work too well together. But like I said, these sorts of decks that are all built around just maximizing fast starts and don't mind mulliganing a little bit more often do work in best of one. So I'm excited to try it out at least, but yeah, this is kind of a crazy, weird one for sure. And then the final Timeless deck I got here is kind of another wild one. This is another one where we've got a lot of moving pieces going on, but I really wanted to try and build around Wight of the Reliquary in Timeless, because I think this card has the potential to be good in Historic as well, right? This is significantly better than Knight of the Reliquary. A mana cheaper is, you know, an enormous difference, but the fact you can also use this to ramp is a really big deal, right? Knight of the Reliquary just cashes in lands for lands. This cashes in creatures for lands. So you cast this on turn 2, and then you can sacrifice a creature and ramp going into your following turn, which is a pretty big deal. And the reason why I was more excited for this card, or why I wanted to try it in Timeless first as opposed to Historic, is because this you can actually convert this into a win with Field of the Dead, right? In Historic, we don't really have good ways to actually convert the land fetching into a win, whereas obviously in Timeless where we have Field of the Dead, we can use it there. So Wight of the Reliquary, we obviously have to run creatures that we're happy to sacrifice. So first of all, we got Colney Garden. Maybe I should be running this in higher numbers, because you know you can obviously go Colney Garden, sacrifice it to the Knight, get another Colney Garden there as just another sacrifice fodder. So if you're running Historic without Field of the Dead, I think you probably want 4 Colney Garden. The reason I'm running 1 here is just because of Field of the Dead, right? We want to get it online as early as possible, especially because we're going to be a lot slower at getting it online compared to a deck like Titan. But if you're comparing the two, this is obviously a mid-range deck that is going to be able to interact with the opponent a lot better, right? Titan is all about ignoring the opponent and just getting Field of the Dead online as fast as possible. This list gets Field of the Dead online eventually, but has Grief, Flare of Malice, Thoughtseize after sideboard as interaction to slow the opponent down, if that makes sense. So I'm only running 1 Colney Garden for that reason, but we've also got Bowmasters, where we're very happy to sacrifice the Orc token. We got Bloodghast, which works super well with Wight of the Reliquary, because we can play the Bloodghast, sacrifice it to the Wight, get a land, and then immediately get the Bloodghast back. Works very well with Grief as well, because we can evoke it and then sacrifice it with the trigger on the stack before it goes to the graveyard. And because I'm running Bloodghast as an enabler here, which isn't normally a mid-range card, I'm also going to try running Sorin Imperious Bloodlord alongside Vein Ripper. So obviously Sorin Vein Ripper, very, very powerful in the format we've seen this, but Sorin also gives us another good use to use with Bloodghast when we don't have Wight of the Reliquary. And additionally, another interaction that I'm excited about is Once Upon a Time with Vein Ripper and Sorin, because this then maximizes our chances of finding these cards together, right? We can use Once Upon a Time, and if we have a Sorin, we can try and find the Vein Ripper for this, to get it online on turn 3. Now, having said that, we don't have Dark Ritual, we don't have Deathrite Shaman, so we're not going to get this online before turn 3. But Vein Ripper is also nice with Wight of the Reliquary because we're ramping, right? So we can potentially ramp into the Vein Ripper to cast it. And then we've also got Flare of Malice here, right? We've got a lot of black creatures that we're happy to sacrifice to the Wight that also work well with Flare of Malice, like the Bowmaster's token, the Bloodghast, and the Grief. Then, like I said, we've got Once Upon a Time, we've got Troll and Reanimate package, and then Grief with the Reanimate gives us access to the turn 1 scam. So, again, like the Phoenix deck, this is another deck where there's a ton of different stuff going on. It could be putting the deck in too many different directions. I can very well see some hands with this deck that could be clunky. And I also think that with the speed of the format increasing, using Wight of the Reliquary could just be too slow, right? This is potentially just a card for Historic, where Timeless, the speed of the format is just going to be too much. But I really wanted to try and build around this card, and then thinking of ways that you have of enabling this kind of led me to this particular build. Again, this is probably one of the deck lists out of the whole article I'm the least optimistic about, but I'm excited to try it out because Wight of the Reliquary seems like a really sweet card. So now we're going to be moving on to the Historic deck list, starting off here with Fanatic of Rhonas Devotion. So Devotion has obviously been a key deck in Historic for quite a while now. Been in kind of a weird spot over the past few months where you have difficult matchups against Yawgmoth and Wizards, which are two of the most popular, or the best deck, two of the best decks in the format, which is kind of a rough spot to be in. But you really good against everything else, right? Any deck that isn't fast combo or fast aggro really struggles to keep up with what Devotion is doing. And I think recently it's got some tools that also help to improve the Wizards matchup quite a lot. I think Outcast the Trailblazer has been such a good addition, especially enabling you to cast your 5-drops like Cavalier of Thorns on turn 3, even through removal, right? You have curves where you go Sprawl on 1, plot Trailblazer on 2, and then on turn 3, play land for the turn, cast a Trailblazer, get a green, cast a Cavalier of Thorns, and that is all ramp that can't be disrupted by interaction, which is pretty huge. And then obviously you're running a bunch of 4-power creatures alongside Kiora, and now Trailblazer provides you another way to turn that into card advantage. So this has been a really big addition to the deck. I've also really been liking Wingbane Vantasaur recently as well as a tool against the Wizards deck. Especially if you go Trailblazer into Vantasaur when you have 5 mana, not only do you get a 4/5 reach in play, which is really difficult for Wizards to deal with without Flame of an Orb, but you also get Savage Stomp, so if you do get 5 mana on turn 3 like you'd get off the Trailblazer, you can then kill one of their creatures like a Dreadful Arcanist or a Symmetry Sage, for example, whilst also turning the Wingbane Vantasaur into a 5/6, which is really difficult for them to attack past, even if they have Flame of an Orb, which is a really big deal. And then in Modern Horizons 3, we're getting a really nice addition to the deck as well in Fanatic of Rhonas. Now, obviously 2-mana dorks need to provide significant upside to be worth running over the 1-mana options like Moorland or Elves or Elvish Mystic, but the fact that this can tap for 4 mana is absolutely huge, especially in a deck like Devotion that is already full of creatures with power 4 or greater in order to enable stuff like Trailblazer and Kiora. So even if we don't have a turn 1 Accelerant, this card can lead to some crazy fast starts where we go Fanatic of Rhonas on turn 2, and then if it survives going into turn 3, which having 4 toughness is really big, especially against a deck like Wizards where they need Flame of an Orb or like, Wizards Lightning into play with fire to be able to kill it. You go Fanatic of Rhonas on turn 2, then you can go Outcast the Trailblazer on turn 3, get a mana, turn on Ferocious, tap for 4, then you can cast Cavalier of Thorns the same turn. An even better curve is going Fanatic of Rhonas on turn 2, then cast Outcast the Trailblazer, then cast Kiora, then we can untap the Fanatic of Rhonas, and then we have 6 mana, which enables us to cast Storm the Festival. So in one turn we've gone Trailblazer, Kiora, Storm the Festival. Then if we hit 2 more bigger creatures, we draw a bunch of cards off the Kiora and the Trailblazer, which is an insane curve. You also have curves where you can go even if you don't have Trailblazer, you can go Rhonas into Olgrith Troll or Pelukrinos into Kiora, untap Fanatic, and then you have 5 mana for Cavalier of Thorns, or even just going Rhonas into Olgrith Troll or Pelukrinos into Karn. So this just enables some really crazy curves where we have this survive and then cast a 3-drop. But then the other ability for this to Eternalize is really huge as well, because if you Eternalize this, it comes back as a 4/4, so it's like a self-contained engine because it enables its own Ferocious. If you have a Trailblazer or a Kiora in play, it's another way for you to draw it. And the really big thing here is that I think one of the big issues with Devotion in terms of consistency is that if you rely on your mana dorks to be able to ramp into your top stuff and the opponent has removal, you can just be left, if you miss land drops, with a bunch of uncastable expensive cards in your hand. And this having Ferocious is a really big deal, because if you go Sprawl on 1 into Fanatic of Rhonas on turn 2 and the opponent kills it, on turn 3 you can just immediately Eternalize it, which makes those sorts of starts a lot safer. It makes the opponent's removal less punishing against you as well. Even if you don't have Sprawl on 1, you can still bring this back on turn 4, and if the opponent doesn't have a way to kill it, you just tap for 4 mana immediately. You can cast a Storm the Festival straight away. So I think Fanatic of Rhonas not only enables these really fast, powerful starts more consistently, which is more difficult for a deck like Wizards to disrupt because it has 4 toughness, but it also makes those starts where you struggle against the interactive heavy decks like Rakdos, for example, a lot safer because of the Eternalize as well. So I think this is likely to be a really big upgrade to Devotion, which is already one of the best decks in the format. One change that I've made to this list when porting my current version over is, like I said, I was really liking Wingbane Vantasaur, and it could even be worth trying to find room in the sideboard for it against Wizards, but when we're adding Fanatic of Ronus, I think it's very important to have more ways to trigger it on turn 3, right? You really want to be able to go Fanatic of Ronus on 2 into a 4-power creature on turn 3, so either Trailblazer or Polukranos, which is why I've trimmed... why I've cut the Wingbane Vantasaur for Polukranos. I still think Polukranos is probably very important because you need some kind of roadblock against Wizards, and I think Polukranos, if they don't have Flame of Anor, does achieve that. You could obviously run Old Growth Troll instead, which is probably the more generically powerful of the two, but is weaker against Wizards, which is your more difficult matchup. If you do make that swap, I think it's worth replacing Delighted Halfling with Small Llanowar Elves or Elvish Mystic, because this obviously can't tap for green for Old Growth Troll. But yeah, I think with Fanatic of Ronus, you do want to prioritize more 3-drops. And if this card is as good as I think it is, or if it ends up overperforming, I could even see a world where you maybe cut Cavalier of Thorns for Old Growth Troll and just try and maximize Fanatic of Ronus as a way to accelerate into Storm the Festival and Karn, for example. Maybe not, because obviously Cavalier of Thorns is a very key part of the deck. It is another way that you can stabilize against Wizards more consistently, but this seems very, very high ceiling without, and the floor also seems pretty solid on it as well. So I think this is going to be a really big addition. So next up, we've got another historic deck that's been around for a really long time, but it's kind of fallen off and hasn't been that popular recently, even in Best of 1 where it saw the most success, and that is Elves. But Elves is getting some really big additions in Modern Horizons 3. I think the most notable and most powerful one is Priest of Titania. So obviously Elves has seen some play in Timeless, mainly with Chalice of the Void and Natural Order, but I think, Priest of Titania being 1 toughness and being a creature that you really want to survive when we're getting Fury added to the format, when Orcish Baymasters is still about, probably not going to make it, probably just too vulnerable to most commonly played interaction. In Historic, where Baymaster doesn't have the ETB and basically sees no play, and Fury isn't going to be legal, this card seems really scary to me, because if you've played Wither against Elves, you know that Elvish Archdruid is the key card in that deck, and the extra mana that can provide to be able to pump into stuff like Allosaurus Shepherd or Elvish Warmaster, for example, closes games out really quickly. And Priest of Titania giving you the same effect for a mana cheaper. Obviously, you don't get the buff, but the main thing you're interested in off Archdruid and cards like Circle of Dreams Druid is the ability to give you this mad acceleration where you can produce a ton of mana very quickly. The other thing I'm really excited about with Priest of Titania is Tyvar Jubilant Brawler. So Tyvar, when it came out, I think the deck I was most excited to try it in was Elves, because obviously the big weakness of Archdruid and Circle of Dreams Druid was you need to untap with them to get value off them, whereas the passive on this enabling you to tap the turn they come down is really big. That is such a big speed increase, and also just makes the deck a lot less vulnerable to interaction, both because you have a Planeswalker which is harder for them to kill, and because if they kill it you can still tap it for mana beforehand, which is really big as well. The big weakness, or the big issue I had when trying Tyvar in Elves, was that the -2 off Tyvar not being able to get back Archdruid and Circle of Dreams Druid did come up. I was just really hoping to have a 2-mana creature that had that same effect, and now we're getting that in Priest of Titania, right? The Tyvar builds that I tried, they felt very close, but that felt like the thing we were missing, and that's exactly what we're getting in Priest of Titania, so I'm really excited to return to this and try it out again. We're also getting a couple of other new cards that I think are going to be nice upgrades here. First is Eladamri Korvakdal, probably completely butchering the pronunciation on this, but this is basically a 3-mana creature future sight, so kind of similar to Realm Walker, but it can cast creatures of any type rather than a specific type. Obviously in this list where the vast majority of creatures are elves, that's not really going to make a difference, but that difference is going to be notable if you're running a deck like Yawgmoth, for example. I could see maybe Yawgmoth being interested in running this as a Chord of Calling tutor target to refuel if you're pretty low on resources, because I've run stuff like Wickerwing Effigy in the past, and this just seems a lot better there. Speaking of which, I could also see this being useful in Timeless Yawgmoth, not only as a way to pull ahead in terms of card advantage if you are low on resources, but also as a way to cheat your natural order targets into play if you draw them, because one of the most awkward things with Timeless Yawgmoth was drawing your Crater Hoofs, drawing your Atraxes, and this provides you a Chord of Calling way to cheat those in play. But anyway, I digress, that's a different deck. In this specific list, I think what the main use I'm going to be using it for is, like I said, Chord of Calling when we're low on resources, because one issue with Elves is you can have a very fast start where you get a lot of stuff into play and you have a lot of mana, but then you run out of gas a little bit. Maybe the opponent kills your Allosaurus Shepherd to deny you the pump, and then you're kind of out of stuff to do with your mana. In those spots, Chord of Calling for Elladrami and just casting a bunch of elves off the top is really big. And as you can see, we've got a very high creature count, and we've got 34, so chances of us whiffing on this are pretty low. And part of that is also because of another new card in Disciple of Freyalise. So this is another MDFC we're getting. Can be played as an untapped land for 3 lives, like all the other MDFCs. And the other side is an elf itself as well. So, some nice synergy going on here. But the main thing I'm interested in here is, like I said, Elves does sometimes have this issue where you draw a bunch of ramp and don't have many payoffs, and this gives you a decent payoff, right? You can either play this as a land early if you need, or if you have a lot of mana off your Mystics and your Llanowar and your Desperate Sentinels, and particularly your Priest of Titanias, you can just hold this as a threat and then just cast it if you don't have anything else at your top end, which seems really nice to kind of fix that issue that ramp decks have of sometimes drawing too much ramp, sometimes drawing too many payoffs. And then additionally, it also makes Eladamri better, because if you're going off on top of your library, having this, the front side, it sees as a creature which you can play off the top. Obviously 6 mana is going to be tricky, but if you have a bunch of mana off Priest of Titania, you can hardcast it. If not, you can also activate the second ability of Eladamri to cheat it into play as well, which seems really nice. So this seems really nice in terms of improving consistency. And then Chord of Calling, we also can run a relatively new card in Voja, Jaws of the Conclave, which isn't a card I've had a chance to try out yet, but I've heard it's very good in Elves, and I could definitely see it, right? If you're in a situation where you have a wide board, but you don't have any way to pump it, you can just Chord of Calling for this, pump your whole board, and then you can close games out pretty quickly as well. So I'm really excited to try this out. I think Priest of Titania is definitely the biggest upgrade, but Disciple Freyalise and Eladamri seem like really nice consistency tools as well. So really excited to return to Elves and see how good it is. And then next up, we've got a new version of Muxus Goblins. So Muxus Goblins has been one of my all-time favourite historic decks, but it just hasn't been very good recently. I think the Rebels build is generally much better because it's faster. But the big issue with Goblins is that for Muxus to be good, you need to be running a very high Goblin count. And in order to do that, you can't really afford to run many non-creatures. So you struggle against decks like Wizards that require early interaction. And you also struggle against the other decks that go a bit faster than you, like Yawgmoth, for example, because you don't have that much interaction. And then the other issue is that, again, you want to run a very high Goblin count, but you also want to try and run ways to accelerate into Muxus to be able to race other decks like Yawgmoth and Wizards, but there really haven't been that many good options for Goblins that also ramp you and aren't super weak to removal, for example. But we're getting some tools in Modern Horizons 3 that could help that. So first of all, we got Mogmob here. So 3 mana, 3/3, and you sack it to deal 3 damage divided among 1, 2, or 3 targets. So first of all, this is a Goblin that provides you with extra interaction, which is really nice. So we have a high enough Goblin count by running this that can also pick off creatures. 3 damage is a very important amount to be able to deal, especially against a deck like Wizards. Obviously, 3 mana for 3 damage isn't super efficient, but against a deck like Wizards, that's what this deck was missing, right? We do have Munitions Expert, but you need to be able to deal 3 damage against Wizards. And Munitions Expert was just too slow to be able to do that. So Mogmob, even though it is a little slow, does just buy you time against Wizards, which can often make the difference. And then the other deck that I mentioned, Yawgmoth, this being able to pick off multiple creatures seems really good at slowing down the opponent's setup as well, right? If the opponent goes, Gilded Goose into Colony Garden, you use Mogmob to cut off their mana dork and another creature, so they have fewer creatures in play to sacrifice. So Yawgmoth seems pretty big as well. So this seems like it could help a lot against the matchups that Goblins usually struggle against, while still keeping your Goblin count high enough for Muxus. Then the other card that I'm excited about, and this is probably the one I'm most excited about out of all of them, is Warren's Soultrader. So this is a really powerful effect, and I think this card is going to enable a lot of different 3-card combos, but, on a tangent, they're probably going to be really difficult to set up consistently and still have a good deck. I'm mainly excited to try this one in alongside Muxus as well, because it enables you to get it down and produce treasure tokens to be able to ramp into Muxus the following turn. So Skirk Prospector is the best Goblin that allows you to ramp into Muxus, but it's so vulnerable. It's like a removal magnet. The opponent's going to prioritize killing this straight away, and you can't do stuff in response, really, right? You have to wait until the turn you want to cast Muxus to use the Skirk Prospector to generate mana. The fact that the Soultrader produces treasure tokens means that the turn it comes down, even if the opponent kills this, you can still, in response, just sacrifice 2 other Goblins, get 2 treasure tokens, so when you untap for your turn 4, you can just play a land and immediately play Muxus. So this seems like the card I was waiting for in Muxus Goblins, in that it's a Goblin that can accelerate you into Muxus that isn't super vulnerable to interaction like a War Chief or a Goblin and Archomancer is, for example. Now, my one issue with this particular list, like the rest of the list is pretty standard, right? I've got Goblin Trap Finder here, as just a good goblin to sacrifice with Soultrader. I think the important thing that I was going to get to is that Soultrader, for it to be effective, you need to have cheap goblins that you're happy to sacrifice, right? Which is why I'm running Trap Finder here. Having said that, I think you probably want more cheap goblins to be able to sacrifice, because the whole goal with Soultrader, I think, is to be able to play it on turn 3 and then sacrifice 2 other goblins so that you can just play Muxus on turn 4. And so I think for Soultrader to be good, you probably want to be running something like Runvelt Hordemaster, or maybe I can't remember the name of it. The 2-mana goblin that also produces another goblin token when it enters the battlefield. Probably in place of Mogmob, unfortunately. I think if Wizards is really popular still, then Mogmob might be necessary. But for Soultrader to work efficiently, I feel like you probably want more 2-drops to consistently be able to go Soultrader on 3, sack 2 goblins, Muxus on 4. I think that's probably the key curve that you really want to be trying to set up. One other new card that we're getting here, and this is another effect that I've really wanted in Goblins for a long time, is Boggart Trawler. And this is basically a land that's also a goblin that can, or an untapped land, importantly, that also provides you with graveyard hate. So in this particular list, I'm using this as a one-of Goblin Matron choose the target in case we need to find a land, which is very important because, you know, Goblins is a deck that really wants to keep finding its land drops to be able to cast Muxus, but also gives you main deck graveyard hate access, which is pretty nice as well. Now, this card solves a big issue I've had with the deck in the past where Goblins, especially Muxus builds, are very mana hungry. If you miss land drops, that can cut you off Muxus, which is a very big deal. So typically, I've always found that you want to be running 25 lands in a Muxus deck at minimum most of the time. But the issue there is that you need also to have a high goblin count, and having Boggart Trawl as both a land and a goblin really helps to kind of fix that issue in a lot of ways. Now, having said that, this particular build, because we're running Mogmob, can't afford to run Boggart Trawler as a land in very high numbers because we need 23 red sources to be able to cast this one on curve. And so, but like I said, if we're trying to maximize Soultrader and we replace Mogmob with some number of Runvelt Hordemaster or the other 2-mana goblin, I think you can run 4 copies of Boggart Trawler, maybe go up to basically 25 lands between the two, if that makes sense. And then you've got a high land count for Muxus and a high goblin count as well, which seems pretty nice. So I've got Mogmob in here because I want to try the new card, and I think it is going to be important, especially if Wizards is still quite popular, but I can see replacing it with maybe 3 Hordemaster and then just running the full 4 copies of Boggart Trawler to try and fix that issue as well. And then the other really nice thing about Soultrader here is that I think this build gives Muxus a way to win the turn it comes down without having to run clunky 4-mana cards. Because the other issue with Muxus in the past has been that because you're so focused on ramping into Muxus, you really want Muxus to be able to win the turn it comes down in most scenarios. So in the original builds of Muxus Goblins, the main way that you'd win the turn Muxus comes down is by hitting Krenko alongside a Haste Lord, activate the Krenko, and then just attack with a bunch of creatures. You obviously had Matron as well, so you could sometimes activate Krenko, then use Prospector to play another Krenko and activate that, and then you just go super wide and attack the opponent. The issue with that, though, is that you really need to be running 4 Warchief, 4 Chieftain, 4 Krenko, which is 8 3-drops and 4 4-drops, and then most of those lists would want to be running 4 Matron as well, so you'd have 12 3-drops and 4 4-drops, which is a really, really clunky curve. And also, Chieftain and Warchief are very vulnerable to interaction. Krenko also super vulnerable to interaction if you don't have one of the Haste Lords stay in play. So that build kind of fell off quite a while ago. Then the follow-up to that build, something that I tried a while back, was running Slinggang Lieutenant alongside Pashlik Mons. So you go wide off Muxus and then sacrifice your board to Slinggang Lieutenant. And if you have a Pashlik Mons in play, every goblin you sacrifice is 2 damage, and you can kind of ping the opponent down that way as well. And that is still a decent way that you could build it, but I've got 2 main concerns about that. First of all, you still need to run 4 drops, which is a little bit clunky. And second of all, I still expect Vein Ripper to be pretty popular. And if Vein Ripper, if the opponent has a Vein Ripper in play, it basically just shuts off your entire win condition because you sacrifice a goblin, the opponent just drains you for 2 as well. So Warren Soultrader potentially opens up another way that we can win off Muxus the turn it comes down without needing to run clunky 4 drops and still being able to beat Vein Ripper in certain scenarios, and that is revolving around Battlecry Goblins. So this is something that has been viable in the past, but you would need to hit exactly Battlecry Goblin Skirk Prospector, which wasn't super likely. So the way it works is you get Battlecry Goblin in play off Muxus, alongside Prospector or Soultrader, sacrifice 2 goblins to produce 2 red mana, activate the Battlecry Goblin to give your whole board haste, and then if the opponent blocks, You wait for them to block, then sacrifice the creatures that they blocked, pump all the mana into Battlecry Goblin again to just force through a ton of extra damage. Now, like I said, this has been viable in the past with Prospector, but Prospector's only a 4 of, right? So the chances of hitting that off Muxus are pretty low. Now with Warren's Soultrader, we also have Soultrader, so we can go Muxus into Soultrader and Battlecry Goblin, sacrifice 2 goblins for 2 treasures, activate the Battlecry Goblin, and then same thing again, wait for them to block, then sacrifice again, pump the whole board again. Now obviously Battlecry Goblin is only a 4 of, but we're also running Matron here, so for this to work, you would need to you'd only need to hit Warren plus Battlecry Goblin, Prospector plus Battlecry Goblin, Soultrader plus Matron, or Prospector plus Matron, assuming you have enough goblins to sacrifice, which is pretty exciting because getting to lower the curve of this deck is something I've been wanting to do for a while because it makes the deck really clunky when you don't have Muxus. And also removing the 4-drops means that you could potentially look at running cards like Crucius again, right? You could use Crucius to tutor Muxus and still have your Muxus hits be able to win the game as well, which is something else I might look into. But either way, this has been a deck that I've really wanted to, make good again for quite a while. And I think Soultrader especially, but also Boggart Trawler and maybe Mogmob to a certain extent, kind of enable this deck to be viable again, hopefully. Another card as well that I haven't really got to test with in Muxus builds for quite a while because they haven't been that good is Cavern of Souls. And running this, especially when your whole game plan is about getting Muxus into play as early as possible, seems really, really important, especially against counterspell decks. So I'm super excited to play this. Not 100% sure it'll be good enough, but I'm optimistic that Soultrader should definitely make Muxus builds a lot more viable. And then finally, we've got another kind of speculative pick, and it's also just another best of one deck, but Collected Conjuring is probably my favourite card in Arena. Maybe not, but it's one of my top 5 for sure. And this has been one of my pet decks for a while. Collected Conjuring in Arclight Phoenix decks is really, really sweet because obviously if you go Conjuring into 2 sorceries and you hit stuff like, Faithless Looting to get Phoenixes in the graveyard, you then get your Phoenixes back straight away, which is really big. And this is another shell that I feel like could capitalize on Buried Alive, because if you go Collected Conjuring and you hit a Buried Alive and another sorcery, you get to put 3 Phoenixes into your yard in addition to another sorcery, and then just get 3 Phoenixes back straight away, which seems super powerful. So again, this has been a pet deck of mine for a while. It hasn't really felt powerful enough in years, honestly, but this edition seems like it could be what this deck was missing. Again, not 100% sure, not saying this is going to be tier 1 or whatever, but this is a pretty significant power spike to this archetype, so I'm very excited to try it out at the very least. So there's a lot of other stuff going on here. If we look, obviously we want to run as many sorceries as possible because we really want to maximize getting value off Collected Conjuring. And the deck building puzzle from my experience running Conjuring in Phoenix is you want to run a high enough density of 3 mana sorceries that Conjuring is high impact, but you also want to have a very high density of 1 mana sorceries so that you can still just naturally get back Arclight Phoenix when you don't have the Collected Conjuring. So obviously we want Buried Alive. I think this is just the highest impact card to hit off the Conjuring. Pieces of the Puzzle is also excellent, not only to hit off Conjuring because you can bin Phoenixes off it, but it's also great at finding Conjuring and just ensuring you don't run out of gas. And then another new card that also helps you have enough sorceries that Conjuring is high enough impact without really eating into other spots in the deck is Sundering Eruption, which is another MDFC that can be played as an untapped land for 3 mana, and then you can destroy land and the opponent gets a basic. So again, this isn't going to be great against every deck, but this is going to be especially good against Devotion because it can take out a land attached with Utopia Sprawl or a Nykthos, obviously. Ugin's Labyrinth is going to be legal in Historic, which is a card I'm very surprised is going to be legal there. And this taking out Ugin's Labyrinth is going to be very big because they lose the imprint card as well. And then, just any deck with a greedy mana base, this is going to be nice against, or just if the opponent's running utility lands, this is going to be good as well. So just increases our chances of getting a decent hit off Collected Conjuring and helps a lot against those sorts of fast mana decks like Devotion or Ugin's Labyrinth, which I imagine Phoenix would struggle against naturally. And then the rest, like I said, is all 1 mana stuff. Sleight of Hand, just the best sorcery cantrip we have. Strike It Rich here is very nice as a way to ramp into Collected Conjuring to accelerate our game plan a little bit, and is also nice at enabling us to get back Phoenix on turn 2 because we can go Strike It Rich on 1 into, say Thoughtseize, Sleight of Hand, Faithless Looting in 1 turn, maybe bin a couple of Phoenixes and get them back straight away. And it's also very nice with Demi-Lich. So as you can see here, we've got a couple of one-off creatures, and that is because Buried Alive can obviously put any creatures into the graveyard. So we can pick to put 2 Phoenixes and a Demi-Lich, 2 Phoenixes and an Ox of Agonis, for example. And Strike It Rich is very nice because say we go Collected Conjuring and we hit Buried Alive and Strike It Rich, we can choose to put 2 Phoenixes and a Demi-Lich into the graveyard, and then Strike It Rich produces an extra mana, which then enables us to cast the Demi-Lich, which is pretty nice. So, you know, it's not only accelerant, but it can also enable us to cast Demi-Lich from the graveyard more consistently. Speaking of which, Orcs of Agonis also just a good card in Phoenix, but if we are out of gas, we can just bury it alive, put an Ox in the graveyard, and then just escape it to refuel our hands. We've also got Thoughtseize here as just interaction. I found, you know, in previous builds of Conjuring Phoenix, I really wanted to run Thoughtseize as just a way to improve matchups against combo and control, which can be difficult matchups, but it felt very hard to justify splashing a third colour just for Thoughtseize. Now with Buried Alive, which is basically the entire reason to return to this archetype, we already want to be running black mana anyway, so I think Thoughtseize is an auto-include. We got Shovelslide as extra interaction. You could obviously run Bloodchief's Thirst in this slot, but the fact that Shovelslide is instant speed on the draw makes me prefer that more. And then obviously we got Faithless Looting here to be able to pitch the Arclight Phoenix into the graveyard, so I'm super excited to try this one out. The mana base is a big issue with this deck, though, because Phoenix is a deck that needs very specific mana, especially if you're trying to cast 3 more 1-mana spells to get back the Phoenixes. So this mana base is having to run 4 Confluence and a number of Shocklands, in addition to Sundering Eruption, which deals you 3 damage when you play it as a land. So mana base is definitely an issue, but I'm so excited to try this out. Conjuring is one of my favourite cards, and I do feel with Buried Alive, this could be a significant power boost to the deck. I'm very excited to try it out in best of 1 anyway. Again, not super optimistic there's going to be tier 1, but I'm going to be trying to make this one work for sure. So those are all the decks. I'm so excited for this set. Honestly, this is the most excited I've ever been for a set. Outside of this, I have a ton of other ideas that I'm really excited to try out as well, that I either haven't had time to Theorycraft, or I just can't figure out the right builds until I finally get my hands on it. So I'm going to be playing basically non-stop once this releases, and hopefully I'll be able to get out a bunch of deck guide videos. Obviously, as usual, I want to take the time, make sure that the lists that I'm working on are actually good, make sure I get enough reps in to figure out the weaknesses, come up with refined versions, and then, yeah, hopefully over the next few weeks, I'll have a bunch of deck guide videos. Again, apologies for the lack of videos over the past few weeks, but my sole attention has been on, preview content for Modern Horizons 3 and just getting ready for this set to release, because it felt like a bit of a waste trying to make new Timeless and Historic decks when I think the format, well, both formats are likely to completely change with the release of this set. Definitely let me know what you think of these lists. If you think there's any cards or, stuff that tweaks you could make to improve them, definitely let me know in the comments. Also, let me know what decks you're planning to build. I'd love to hear what ideas people have. Either way, I'm so excited for this set to drop, and hopefully I'll have a bunch of content coming out over the next few weeks with deck guides. Either way, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.